Hello everybody, welcome to the Drydock episode 279 part 2, continuing the Patreon Drydock, and this will obviously be the very final video of 2023 to be released, so let's get on with questions, shall we? Asuria Sky asks, if someone tipped off a suitably aggressive Royal Navy Admiral that the Germans were planning on surrendering on the 11th of November 1918, instead of spreading the good news, the Admiral instead throws the planned torpedo bombing of Wilhelmshaven into high gear. There are no changes to the production of the Sopwith Cuckoo in order to avoid tipping everyone off, and the Admiral in question can only order additional training. On the 1st, every available ship and Cuckoo set sail for the operation. Who is our mystery Admiral, and how does the attack most likely go, and what are the most likely immediate aftermath? Well, believe it or not, it probably actually would have been Beatty. He had an interest in launching a mass Cuckoo attack before the war ended. He expressed that idea actually the year before. At the time of the armistice, around about 90 Cuckoos had been delivered. So if we go with maybe a month before that, and let's say 80 Cuckoos, because you've got to get pilots trained up and actually have everything ready. So you've got 80 Cuckoos, great. The main problem you're going to have is launching platforms, because you've got Furious, Argus just by the skin of its teeth, Campania, Ark Royal, and those kind of things. But outside of Vindictive as well. But outside of Argus, none of the other Royal Navy aircraft carrying vessels can actually retrieve their Cuckoos. So it's essentially going to be a one-way trip. I mean, obviously they could ditch and get picked up. It's not a suicide mission, but the only way for the Cuckoos to survive as aircraft would either be for the Royal Navy task group to get within 80 miles or less of Wilhelmshaven, at which point, in theory, if they made a dead straight run towards Belgium, they might just about reach the Allied front lines before they run out of fuel. Alternatively, I suppose, considering it's coming up right to the very end of the war, you could launch a bit further out than that, and then they could just double back and land in Denmark. Or actually, to be honest, if they really wanted to and didn't mind spending a couple of weeks as interned prisoners of war, you could launch the raid from much further out, sort of middle of the North Sea, a much safer area, and just hop across the border, across the Ems, and put down in the Netherlands. And at that point, that might actually work out a lot better, because it would allow the launch to take place much further away outside of the German defensive minefields, and the aircraft would have easily enough fuel to make it into the Netherlands, at which point, given that you've got foreknowledge the Germans are going to surrender on the 11th, spending a few weeks as the guests of the Dutch is probably not the worst thing to ever happen to the British airmen or their aircraft. But not only are you not getting them back, it's like, how many aircraft can you actually launch? I mean, let's be really generous and say that by absolutely cramming everything everywhere possible, you can get maybe on average a dozen aircraft off of Vindictive, Ark Royal, Campania, Furious, because remember, she's not full flush deck at this point, etc. And okay, Argus, if you absolutely ram it, you could probably get 20 off of that. You're still a little bit short of the 80, but you've got the flying off platforms, basically towed barges with a launch platform on them, although you might need a slightly longer one to get a Cuckoo airborne as opposed to a Sopwith pup. And you've got a few other, bodged together aircraft carrying vessels. You could even go with the idea of just hastily converting a merchant ship or two, maybe grabbing a tanker or something like that, quickly slapping an impromptu flight deck on it. It's only got to work once after all. In terms of the attack itself, based on the research I've done trying to model how the proposed full-scale one in 1919 would have gone, the actual element of surprise is probably going to be almost total. Nobody is going to be expecting this. There isn't any combat air patrol. There's no radar. So the Germans essentially have negligible ability to respond with fighters. There's not major fighter interceptor bases near Wilhelmshaven, because that's not a thing in World War I, certainly not in Germany. Wilhelmshaven itself, again, anti-aircraft defense is minimal, to say the least, and the attacks planned to happen at night, at which point, even less likely for anything to actually be successfully brought off. In fact, the most vigorous anti-aircraft defense possible is actually from the fleet itself. There are anti-torpedo nets, however, they're mostly protecting the base itself rather than the individual ships, because by this point torpedo nets have been removed from the individual ships. So assuming the navigation goes well, which is always a big question, and assuming that presumably somebody somewhere is going to be dropping some flares to illuminate things, it's relatively likely that the torpedoes that are dropped on target will probably hit. Plus, of course, the fact that at this point the High Seas Fleet is in the middle of a mutiny, so they're going to be even less prepared than they normally would be. If we assume that, let's say, 70 odd cuckoos actually get their torpedoes off, so that's allowing for a few aircraft dropping flares, a few aircraft with mechanical issues, etc. It's going to come down to what they target. How easy is it going to be to distinguish the battle cruisers and the battleships from the cruisers and the destroyers in the middle of a dark environment with, just flares illuminating things. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese claimed about a 70% hit rate from torpedoes dropped. Now, granted, obviously that was during the day, but it was also against an enemy that was putting up at least some opposition. And there are losses at Pearl Harbor, obviously, to torpedoes where the depth control doesn't work and it hits the mud or whatever. But if we assume, let's say, because it's World War I and it's still nighttime, let's half that to 35%. That gives us about 25 torpedoes actually hitting. It could be higher, but let's be a little bit conservative here. 25 torpedoes hitting. German capital ships have shown they can eat a torpedo or two without too many problems. So I suspect that you're going to see maybe 5 or 6 ships maybe take multiple hits on that assumption on a good day if you're distributing 25 hits, which will be enough to sink them. And then the remaining dozen or slightly under dozen torpedoes will probably score single hits on various vessels. Now, some of them, if they're not very well attended because, mutinies, etc., may settle on the bottom, the way that California did at Pearl Harbor, but would be salvageable. Others may just have flooding or whatever. Obviously, bearing in mind that these ships do not have even the torpedo defenses of the old battleships at Pearl Harbor. Now, bearing in mind that we are making a lot of assumptions chained together here, but if we assume that this is representing 5 or 6 capital ships, so being a little bit generous here, that the flares have allowed them to pick out what ships are which, at least for some of the aircraft, then it still comes down to which ships have been caught and sunk, because, it could be that a cuckoo has dropped a bunch of flares over the Nassaus, and, all 4 Nassaus and a Helgoland are sitting on the bottom. That doesn't really manifestly change all that much in the immediate aftermath of things, because, even the Allies didn't want those, apart from 1 or 2 of the Helgolands. Conversely, if it's, Baden, a Koenig, Hindenburg, Seydlitz, and a couple of Kaisers on the bottom, that's a much, much bigger issue. If we evenly distribute it somewhat, it's still going to be something of an issue because it has manifestly weakened the German fleet, and it has also shown that there is an attack that the German fleet do not have a defense against, and certainly any meaningful defense against, and that's going to cause a higher percentage of, as well as weakening their position at Versailles, the negotiations that will eventually lead to Versailles, For the armistice, it's going to mean a higher proportion of the German fleet is going to be at Scapa. And who knows what's... I mean, they're probably still going to scuttle. They're about even more nervous every time an aircraft buzzes over Scapa. Is this a prelude to being finished off by a stab in the back kind of thing? But in terms of the high seas fleet in the immediate aftermath, it could be very interesting, because it could be, the final blow that just causes everyone to throw the towel in morale-wise. Our superiors can't even protect us from little canvas and wooden kites. What's the point of anything? Or it could be a rallying point where everyone goes, no, we were all arguing amongst ourselves, but now we have been attacked in our home port by those dastardly English. So, there's a lot of assumptions that go into this. As I said, and the only reason I'm even vaguely happy to, with very heavy caveats, make these assumptions is because since the last time someone asked this question, I've been doing a lot of reading into the plan and what was available and what likelihoods there were, and it's still nowhere near finished with that. But yeah, there you go. If the gods had wanted us to be happy, they would have given us a delicious honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oh Look Mead asks, in the latter part of the period the channel covers, the Royal Navy had a complex system for naming turrets. Could you please enlighten us to these mysteries? So for the majority of Royal Navy ships, you would start with your main turret with the foremost one. That would be A turret, as in the letter A. The next one, which would typically be a super-firing turret, would be B turret, and that would usually be it for your forward turrets. If you had midships turrets, you would have P and Q, which, at least in the initial phases, when you had things like the Invincibles, the P turret would be the port turret, Q turret would be the starboard turret, and then your aft turrets would be X, which would be, if it was a single turret aft, that would be X turret, and if you had a super-firing pair of turrets aft, X would be the super-firing turret, and then Y turret, which would be your at-deck level secondary, well, not secondary, but second gun turret. This will allow you to identify most Royal Navy warships, but, as with all things, there are plenty of exceptions. So, if you have a single amidships turret, logically you would think this would be P turret, because P turret is the first out of P and Q, but no. The Royal Navy decided that if you had a single amidships turret, which most, pretty much, well, in fact, all of the 13.5-inch ships except for Tiger did, this would now be Q turret. So, basically a turret that didn't have a direct aft firing arc or wasn't aft of the mainmast. This would be Q turret. So, Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, the Iron Dukes, Orions, and the World War I King George V, they all have a Q turret. For something like HMS Agincourt, as you can see, which has two amidships turrets, these would be P and Q, and P was the forwardmost turret, Q was the aftmost turret in that amidships pair, which is a bit of a return to sanity. So why they decided Q instead of P if you had a single amidships turret, who knows? Then you have Agincourt herself, unofficially, because there were 7 turrets, unofficially people seem to have sometimes called them by the days of the week, Monday through Friday. Most documents suggest that the Royal Navy actually went with an almost US Navy style numbering system of 1 through 7, but there are also period documents that refer to them as A, B, P, Q, X, Y, and Z, because of course British, so Z, not Z. Although, to be fair, those are in the minority, those documents. And then it gets even more fun when you get in the interwar period and World War II to British ships that have more than 2 turrets up front. And once again, there is an annoying lack of consistency, because you would think, logically, that if you have a 3rd turret up front and you have A turret and B turret, you would have C turret. And indeed, there are unfortunately, minority of documents which do refer to the 3rd turret as C turret. And as a general rule of thumb, amongst people of a naval history inclination, if you refer to the 3rd turret on the forward part of a British warship as C turret, most people will understand what you mean, and they'll just go, yep, cool, I know what you're talking about. So like with the Nelsons, for example, or the Didos, the two main offenders in this category. But you will occasionally get the pedants who are technically correct, which as it turns out in this case is not necessarily the best kind of correct, who will point out that sea turret is not officially a Royal Navy designation. Well, depends what you mean by official. If you mean, is there any Royal Navy documentation that names a turret as sea turret? Yes, there is. But it's not the majority, and it's not the the highest level of documentation. So even there, if you're trying to be technically correct, it should be absolutely technically correct, not generally technically correct. Anyway, going forwards, on Nelson, annoyingly, they decided that the third turret was going to be X turret. This makes no sense to me, because X turret is usually the first aftmost turret. I could maybe see some logic if it was the G3s or the N3s where they have that amidships turret, which theoretically should be Q. More practically, it should be P turret, but they was going to use Q turret, but whatever. Maybe you could call that one X. Who knows? But why you would call the third turret forward X, I don't know, but they did. And then, for the sake of confusing everybody in the future, they didn't bother to stick to the convention they just established, because when they built the Dido class, which had two aft turrets, so now you can't use X, so because you have X and Y turrets aft, you didn't go ABC, you went ABQ. So that doesn't really help. Oh, and just to make it extra special, the whole thing where you have two turrets forward and one turret aft, like the King George V's, the Renowns, etc., where it should be ABX, and most ships have ABX. Guess what? That's not consistent. Sometimes it's ABY. There is no rhyme or reason to that. It's somewhat baffling, and to be perfectly honest, it's so scattershot once you get outside of classes that have something approximating a traditional gun layout, that, to be perfectly honest, unless you really want to be picky, I wouldn't bother, because you could call Renown an ABX design and someone's going to yell at you and say no, it's Y. And you could call the World War II King George V an ABY design and have someone yell at you and say no, it's X. And it gets silly. So that's what the naming convention such as, I don't even know if it's really worthy of being called a convention at that stage, but that's roughly what things would be called. About the only thing you can really take any solace in is that if you have a single amidships turret, it's almost certainly going to be a Q turret, and the forward two turrets are going to be A and B. Though that you can rely on, you really can't rely on anything else. Although happily, by the time the Royal Navy switches over to turrets for its secondary batteries, they do at least have a consistent naming policy there. Portside batteries are P1, 2, 3, 4, etc., if you happen to have more than 4. But starboard batteries are not Q, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, they're S, 1, 2, and 3, and 4. Have fun with that one. John M. asks, how many navies observe the crossing of the equator tradition? Did it start out as a serious thing and slowly morph into what we have today? As far as I'm aware, and obviously with that caveat, I think it seems to have been observed by almost all the European navies or European descended navies, ones that have incorporated their traditions from European navies. So, the US, Australia, New Zealand, etc., etc. Now, exactly where that origin came from, or exactly what the origin of the ceremony is a little bit obscure. In the wonderful European tradition of naming or blaming everything that you can't quite explain or you don't think is particularly nice on somebody else nearby, see the various names for syphilis in the European continent and in the UK, for example. Various sources at the time anyone bothered to write anything down about it attribute it to basically, we adopted it from all these other guys, all these other European nations. So somebody certainly was practicing it for quite a while, possibly everybody. There's some suggestion that the initial ceremonies were conducted when a particularly famous headland was sighted. So perhaps, if you're rounding the tip of Cornwall in the UK, or the tip of Brittany in France, or maybe if you pass through the Gibraltar Straits if you're Spanish, or I don't know, go between Sicily and Italy if you're Italian, etc., etc. Now, the following is supposition by me, but based on the kind of slight confusion and everyone blaming everybody else, and it apparently being a holdover from older times, then being kind of incorporated into crossing the equator once going around a particular headland was no longer of any particular note, I would personally suspect that the very deepest origins of this tradition, if indeed there are any, might actually go back to ancient times. Because we do know that, well, we know sailors are a very superstitious lot anyway, but back in the ye olde days, Greco-Roman, Phoenician, and earlier, there was a semi-regular habit of sacrificing to the gods when you wanted something to change, when you didn't want something to change, when something had gone particularly well for you, or when something had gone particularly bad and you didn't want it to keep being bad. And I would suspect that way back then, if there was a major headland, which usually comes with winds and currents and things, and you successfully rounded that, so, looking at the Mediterranean, that could be the Sicilian Narrows, it could be passage around the bit of Africa that's just to the southwest of Sicily, near Carthage, maybe going around the southern tip of Greece or something like that. In those kinds of instances, if you've managed to make it around or past that particular major point without incurring major issues, you might sacrifice to the gods, whatever your local god might happen to be, and to say thank you for delivering you. And I can see that then developing into a tradition whereby, the sailors who have done that passage will say, well, we have appeased merciful Poseidon by sacrificing to him, but you've not been round here before, so perhaps Poseidon will send something to cause misfortune to you because you haven't sacrificed to him, so you must make a sacrifice to Poseidon, which would explain a transition from everybody to people who have not done this particular passage before. And then, of course, you get into later Roman and then medieval, etc. periods, and the idea of we must appease something because we have done this significant feat would stick around. But of course, animal sacrifices and so forth have mostly gone out the window at that point, and so there's possibly this vague cultural memory of appeasement. Hence, it goes over to vague ceremonies that sailors invent for the lack of anything else better to do, which then transmutes into crossing the equator because that's the last major thing left. As I said, because going around a headland has become somewhat less dramatic than it was perhaps centuries or millennia earlier, and we end up in the situation we have today where, even in the height of revivalist 19th century navies, we've still got, bids to King Neptune and all sorts of weird and wonderful and occasionally violent and worrying ceremonies inflicted on people who have not crossed the equator before. But, as I said, that is supposition on my part, but potentially I think maybe suppositions founded, at least to a degree, in the development of various trends and things that we, or large portions of society in the Western world these days, carry out without really thinking about where they maybe came from. 3 from 2 asks, in the second part of your series on Admiral Cunningham, you mentioned that he was on half pay. Am I assuming correctly that this was just used as a manner of speech at the time, or was there an impact on pay, if not in command? And how has half pay been handled in the Royal Navy during the Channel's lifetime? No, he was literally being paid half his salary, or in practical effect, actually considerably less. So half pay until 1938, when it was abolished, was a Royal Navy practice in basically a bid to reduce costs whilst retaining the services of officers. It's essentially a retainer fee. This is in part from the practice of the Royal Navy commissioning a ship Now, in modern times, the commissioning of a ship comes into commission, it is now in the Navy, and it decommissions either when it leaves naval service completely or occasionally if it's going into a multi-year refit or something like that. But back in the day, in the age of sail, a ship would be commissioned for a specific purpose, for a specific voyage or assignment, and everyone would sign on to that ship at that point, and when the ship comes back and pays off, it would be decommissioned again. And it would go into reserves, and then it would only be brought back into commission when it was sent out on another voyage. Now, that might be the next day, but each voyage or assignment was seen as a separate undertaking. And obviously, the Navy, or the Treasury, to be more precise, wanted to save a lot of money, so they came up with the idea that if a captain is actively employed by the Royal Navy, or an officer of any description, or someone they wish to retain, perhaps a specialist, if they are being actively employed by the Royal Navy, i.e. most of the time they're on a ship, or perhaps if they're in charge of a dockyard or something administrative or ashore, then they receive full pay. However, if there is nothing for them to do at that time, so particularly in the case of seagoing captains, their ship has returned and is either in refit, repair, or in reserves, and there's no new command to move them over to, or new ship to assign them to. So, they're not just going to hang around a dockyard all day waiting for something to happen. They would instead be sent home, but because they're not being actively employed, they would just receive half the money that their pay rate said they were due. And this was kind of seen as a equitable arrangement because it meant that the Royal Navy could, for a reduced expense, retain the services of a large number of officers, which it would need in the event of conflict, but it could maintain them in peacetime when they didn't need them quite so much. It was also a way of quietly getting rid of officers that you really didn't think should be in the fleet anymore, but you couldn't quite find the evidence or the political backing in some cases to actually dismiss from the service. You could just put them on half pay and never call them back to service for a ship command again. Now, the reason I mention that it was usually effectively more than a 50% salary cut was because you had your baseline pay rate, which is what got cut in half, but very often, especially the higher up the chain you went, there would be various allowances. So if you were a specialist officer, let's say a skilled torpedo warfare officer or a gunnery specialist or an aircraft specialist, you would get an extra allowance for that. If you were sent to somewhere that was known to have a high incidence of tropical disease, you would get an essentially hazard pay for that, and so on and so forth. So you could build up in your regular service a reasonable amount of extra allowances and add-ons, etc. But when you went on half pay, all of those stopped as well. So more typically, you might only have about a third to 40% of your actual pay rather than half, which is technically what it would suggest. And indeed, there was a whole argument in the interwar period in Parliament over marriage allowances, because you've got nowadays in the UK, technically there is still a married couple's tax allowance, but in the Royal Navy back then, you actually got a married couple's allowance, i.e. an additional pay for the maintenance of your spouse, presumably, one would hope. But this was only active duty pay. So if you were on the half pay list, this allowance also got stopped. And the argument in Parliament was essentially, well, they don't become half married. In fact, they're even more married, if to a certain degree, when the officer is on half pay than when he's at sea. So it's very, very unfair to cut this. And, there's this whole debate as to whether or not the marriage allowance should be included on the pay list of officers on half pay as much as officers on full pay. HMS Inconceivable asks, as a follow-up on the question about losing your own ships to skirt the naval treaties, what about dockyard fires such as what's happened with the newer USS Bonhomme Richard or USS Miami? No fatalities, if timed correctly, for when there aren't as many workers or crews on board, and the remainder could be well evacuated with proper training. I.e., the question is, could you set fire to your own ship in a dockyard and get away with it? In theory, yes, you could set fire to your own ship whilst it's in dock to essentially, burn it down for the insurance money and get yourself a new ship in under the treaty system. However, there's a few practical and a few strategic issues, one of which is you're not going to be able to do this very often. And given the general desire for class interoperability, and having classes of ships, being economies of scale and so forth, losing a ship to get a single other ship is not, the Navy is not going to be massively in favour of that idea. Secondly, on the more practical side of things, even assuming the ship is in dock and has been de-ammunitioned, etc., which is, for obvious reasons, something you would want to make sure has been done, the big problem would be the size of the conspiracy that you would need, because you would need somebody to set the fires, and set the fires in a way that would be very rapidly and obviously uncontrollable, because, people are trained in how to put fires out. The warships are very, very subdivided, and almost any fire that starts on a warship, even in dock, is probably not going to spread far enough to do enough damage to render the ship inoperable before it's found and contained and then put out. The only way that's going to happen is if either the whole crew is in on the conspiracy and agree to leave it alone, which makes keeping the secret exponentially more difficult, or you wait and maybe put the ship in reserve, have the ship maybe sitting in the reserve fleet, not as the accommodation ship, maybe on the periphery, at which point you've somehow got to sneak someone on board to set the fires. At that point, you might be able to burn it down. But again, it comes back to, once is unlucky, twice is suspicious, three times is hang on a minute. I think there's a pattern emerging here. So you'd be going through an awful lot of expense and still having to set up quite a major conspiracy to reduce your fleet size by one in order to get a single one-off ship as a replacement, which, all things told, it's really too much effort. John McCarthy asks, we often read about the actions of Allied patrol planes in World War II, like the PBY. Japan had some very large long-range aircraft as well, and the abortive Pearl Harbor raid is relatively well known. What other notable actions were Japanese patrol planes involved in? Unfortunately, whilst they are obviously part of the Japanese Navy, being aircraft, the Japanese flying boats, obviously primarily the H-6K and the H-8K, are not aircraft of which I'm hugely aware of. I mean, I know they exist, I know what the capabilities were, I know sort of when and where they were approximately deployed, but as far as specific notable actions by these aircraft, I suspect they're mostly going to be against other aircraft. I know both the H-6K and the H-8K were reputed to be quite tough aircraft with a lot of defensive armaments, but someone like military aviation history or Rex's hangar would probably be able to enlighten you a lot further on specific air-to-air combat incidents. However, there is a sort of notable incident, rather than maybe per se action, which Japanese flying boats were sort of involved with, that potentially had a fairly major impact on the war, and that is in 1944, as the US fleet was preparing the next stage of its invasion of various Japanese-held territories, the Japanese had a plan, which they called Z Plan, which is not the Z Plan or Plan Z of the Germans, it's just Z Plan, or Z Plan if you're American. And this essentially laid out what their response was going to be as and when the US fleet tried to break into the Philippine Sea, and where all their forces were, how many aircraft, how many ships, what kind of aircraft, where they were based, what their operational parameters would be. If the American fleet does this, we will do this. If the American fleet does that, we'll do that. And also what kind of tactics they would use and why. All of this was written up very comprehensively. And then the admiral who was then in command of the combined fleet set out with one of his deputies in another aircraft. They're both on H-6Ks. The H-6Ks hit a storm, and through various shenanigans, both of them ended up crashing. And the aircraft that had the entire contents of the top-secret documents aboard managed to crash in such a way that the box containing said documents floated ashore. There was a whole load of shenanigans with the Japanese realizing the documents had gone missing and terrorizing the local natives to see, had they got the box. Answer, one of them had actually recovered the box and where it was, which nobody told them. But the orders managed to make their way to Filipino guerrilla fighters and their US liaisons, who, realizing that the Japanese, brutal as they were, didn't usually go out murdering civilians and burning down entire villages whilst yelling about salvaged stuff that may have come ashore for no reason whatsoever. They figured these orders, or this document, must be quite important. That got then eventually covertly shipped off to the Allies in Australia. They translated it. That made its way over to Nimitz. Nimitz had it retranslated because its first translation was by the US Army, who didn't understand quite the correlation between some Japanese terms and naval terms. Nimitz realized he essentially had the entire combined fleet battle strategy, albeit obviously it would be slightly modified by the new admiral in charge of the combined fleet, and he got that retranslated, flown out to Admiral Mitchell and company, who were about to embark on what we would know as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, aka the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And thus, with essentially the enemy playbook minus whatever minor changes might have been made subsequently in mind, once the American assault force went forward, although there were baits and opportunities set by the Japanese to lure the American strike forces away, the American admirals, now knowing exactly what the Japanese intended to do in those circumstances, didn't fall for the bait, and instead you ended up with the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. HMS Etc. asks, we acknowledge that during the Age of Sail, a naval formation that had the wind gauge gives those ships an advantage in that they can choose to attack or disengage. Fast forward to the Age of Steam, and finally navies are not at the mercy of the winds. Fast forward some more to the age of the carrier, and now having the wind gauge may be a tactical advantage once again, as carriers would prefer to motor with the wind, giving the aircraft increased lift over the flight deck. I may have this concept reversed. Could you help, please, and discuss? I'm thinking about things like the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and perhaps even Coral Sea and Midway. Okay, so there are three predominant points about the wind in the Age of Sail, the Age of Steam, and the Age of Carriers. So in the Age of Sail, having the weather gauge, which is to be upwind of the enemy, i.e. there's the wind direction blowing down on you and then blowing down on the enemy, that was traditionally held to be the place of advantage because sailing ships can't really maneuver directly into the wind. So if you had the weather gauge, you could choose when and where to attack, and your opponent could either sit there and take it or run away, but they couldn't come after you when you didn't want them to. The disadvantage of that was that the wind would obviously be pushing your ships over slightly away from the wind, and so in particularly heavy weather you may not be able to use your lower gun decks. Conversely, obviously if you're in the lee gauge, you could only accept an enemy action or withdraw, but you were very likely, again unless it was really heavy weather, to have your full range of gun decks available to you because your ships would be heeling away from the wind, which meant your lower gun decks would be well above the waterline. In heavy weather, obviously, the water, the sea, the waves hitting your hull and splashing up might still make those lower gun decks untenable, but that's a separate matter. Now, whether being in the weather gauge or the lee gauge was better or worse depends a lot on the Navy's thinking and the time, because as I said, weather gauge normally held to be the advantage. But in the latter part of the Age of Sail, the British in particular started to look for fighting in the lee gauge because it essentially, with the lee gauge, what it meant was that although you didn't have a choice of when to accept battle, you also were cutting off the enemy's retreat. And so the British started to prefer that because they were confident of accepting battle pretty much whenever, and they liked the idea of preventing French ships and Spanish ships and so forth from being able to run away, considering that thanks to their greater length to beam ratios, assuming they were fresh out of dock, French and Spanish ships were usually a little bit faster. In the age of steam, the wind becomes a little bit more of an interesting factor. The wind affects age of steam ships, i.e. gun-based vessels like you can see here, in a couple of ways. Firstly, if the seas are following the wind, then if you're broadside on, that means you're broadside onto the waves, and you're going to get a lot of roll, which could be generally a net negative for the ship anyway because, stability issues. But specifically, it could be a major problem for your gunnery because if the ship's rolling a lot, it's a lot harder to compensate and calculate for. So ideally, you would want to head into the wind because then, in theory, at least if the seas are following the wind, they won't always do that, but they'll usually be within a point or two. Then if you're heading into the wind, then you have the least amount of roll, and that's good. However, there is another factor which might cause you to want the wind off to a 1/4 off of your port or starboard bow, and that is gun smoke. Because if you are sailing and the wind, so let's say you're sailing broadside on to another ship and you're merrily firing away at each other, and you don't have to be strictly perpendicular, but roughly speaking, then if the wind is behind you relative to the enemy, i.e. you have the weather gauge in Age of Sail terms, you might have a little bit of a problem because the wind will blow your gun smoke, away from the ship, but roughly in the direction of your enemy. So your gun smoke is kind of going to be hanging in front of you, which is going to obscure your ability to see, which is going to affect your gunnery quite a bit. Now, theoretically, it might also obscure you from your enemy, but your enemy, of course, can just wait for you to emerge, keep an approximate lock if the gun smoke is really that bad, and then open fire the minute the smoke clears, whereas you, who can't really see much of anything, the enemy could be doing anything and everything in that time period, and it's going to take you longer to re-establish your fire control solution. Conversely, if you're in the lee gauge and the wind is blowing down on you from the enemy, then your gun smoke is going to be blown back across your ship and away from you and clear pretty quickly. And depending on how close you are to the horizon, what the weather conditions are like, etc., your pall of smoke hanging behind you might actually obscure you, depending on camouflage colours and so on and so forth, and lighting conditions. So ideally, in an Age of Steam gun-based vessel, you want to be in the lee gauge for gunsmoke purposes, but you don't want to be broadside on generally for stability purposes, hence why you'd want to maybe have the wind coming off of a quarter, ideally the port or the bow, one of your bow quarters, either port or starboard. And then once you have carriers, then yes, carriers do prefer to sail into the wind because it increases the amount of lift for the aircraft, minimizes their takeoff run, and maximizes the amount of fuel and munitions they can carry. And that does have some strategic limitations because the enemy might be in a given direction, and you might want to be closing with the enemy, you might want to be stationary relative to the enemy, you might want to be sailing away from the enemy, but you don't really have too much of a choice. If your carriers need to sail into the wind, then either your entire fleet has to change direction and perhaps lose time or go out of position, or your fleet continues and the carrier has to go off and do its own thing. Both types of those tactics are actually exemplified by various actions in World War II, but of course if the carrier goes off to conduct its flight operations on its own and then returns to the fleet, it will be temporarily vulnerable, unless you send some escorts with it, at which point both halves of your fleet are now considerably weaker than they were before. So, yeah, knowing where the wind is coming from is quite important for carrier operations, with a caveat that it does somewhat depend on what you're doing. If you're in the deep ocean and your sole purpose is to carry out carrier operations, then to be honest, heading into the wind is not really a massive issue. Whereas if there's perhaps a corridor beyond which there's the threat of enemy submarines or the threat of enemy aircraft or a coastline or, an enemy fleet coming your way that may or may not be bigger than yours, then suddenly being confined to specific vectors to launch your aircraft can be a major problem. Mark Griffiths asks, I'm aware that warships entering Pearl Harbor render passing honours to the wreck of USS Arizona, and those entering Sydney Harbor render passing honours to the HMAS Sydney Memorial. Are there any other such traditions that you are aware of? I'm not 100% sure, to be perfectly honest. Perhaps those who've more recently served or are serving in various naval services will be able to enlighten us as to any other permanent spots for passing honours to be rendered to wrecks or parts of ships held as memorials. But I am aware that there are some ceremonies associated with the wrecks of ships, particularly with the Royal Navy, which is the Navy obviously I'm the most familiar with in the modern era. For example, there is a yearly ceremony at the wreck of HMS Royal Oak up in Scapa Flow, and I believe it is still Royal Navy policy that if a Royal Navy ship knowingly passes over the wreck of another Royal Navy ship, then they render passing honours to the wreck and those who went down with the ship as a matter of course, and that of course can be anywhere in the world. But unfortunately that's as far as my knowledge extends, subsequent to being enlightened further in the comments. Lord Quack, King of the Ducks, asks, I know this addresses a little bit more of a modern time frame, but given that the ships themselves were generally built pre-World War II, I was hoping you'd be able to answer it. There are several tall ships, such as the USCGC Eagle, NRP Sagres, Gorch Fock, and Amerigo Vespucci, and they're all used as both training ships and ceremonial vessels. Can you explain why navies or the Coast Guard continue to use rigged ships for training, and where the tradition of keeping a fully rigged ship as a sort of national ambassador comes from? I believe the idea of using these fully rigged ships for training is that firstly, it allows for a fairly high concentration of people aboard because you need an unusually large number of people to actually fully man and rig one of these big fully rigged sailing vessels, as compared to the number you would need, technically speaking, to operate a similar sized regular training ship. So that actually leads to cost savings, believe it or not, because if you can train 400 or 500 people, let's say, aboard, or even 200 or 300 aboard a single vessel, as opposed to having to train 80 to 100 people on 3 to 4 training vessels, that's all to the good. Also, I believe they're used to encourage and build teamwork, because on a lot of more modern ships, modern systems tend to be usually operable by a single person or a very small group of people. You can't do that with these kinds of ships. If you're going to manually set the sails on something like the Amerigo Vespucci, you're going to need dozens of people all working in close timing, concert and coordination with each other, plus you need a fair degree of physical fitness. And because these ships can be set to essentially manual mode, no power steering, no navigational assistance, etc. They do have these systems as backups, but you can set them almost back to traditional Age of Sail settings. It allows you to also instruct people in things like the basics of navigation and oceanography without the potential of, getting sidetracked by having only access to modern navigational equipment and so on and so forth. So it sets a very good groundwork from which you can then build by instructing people, okay, well, now you know how to navigate by the sun and the stars and the moon. Now we can introduce you to this much easier GPS unit. But then if, let's say in time of war, your GPS unit gets damaged or jammed or someone starts knocking out GPS satellites, everybody who's been through this ship theoretically knows and hopefully will remember how to navigate via the stars and so forth, which means you actually have some navigational capability left. And I think that's generally the aim of keeping these training ships around. Plus, they look cool. The other thing, as far as using them as a national ambassador, I think that's a holdover from back when the first training ships were put about, because obviously initially training ships would be pretty indistinguishable from warships, save for the fact that whichever ship was a training ship was perhaps a less valuable or older warship. But once you get into the era of steam and then iron and then steel, etc., a lot of the time early on, the ships that were then considered, too old or not powerful or useful enough for frontline services, and thus more likely to be turned into training ships, would be the older age of sail vessels. And apart from all the other things that we've just mentioned, one of the other things is if you're going on a long-distance training voyage, if your Navy's latest and greatest ships are, centre battery or turret ironclads, if an enemy centre battery or turret ironclad or two shows up offshore, you're not entirely sure what their purpose is. If an enemy fully rigged sailing ship with a wooden hull shows up off the shore, chances are they're not there for a fight, because of course they would horribly lose. At which point you kind of start to see a connection between training ships, which serve as a good way to broaden the horizons of your own people, allow you to conduct diplomatic visits, and carry absolutely zero threat, overt or covert, in theory, to the nation that you're visiting, and therefore, it can't be misinterpreted as an attempt at gunboat diplomacy. And then as the 20th century has gone on, that's kind of, I think, gradually rolled into this purpose of a training ship. Now, of course, you can have modern training ships that look like just slightly less armed, full-scale warships, and there are plenty of those around as well, but it's abundantly clear when a tall ship like this shows up that it can only be there for peaceful purposes. Michael Gilson asks, during the first half of the 20th century, what are the pros and cons of geared drives and electric drives relative to each other for surface ships? Did this stay mostly constant, or did it shift back and forth as technology and doctrine changed? The pros and cons for both were pretty much the same throughout both systems' major usages in the navies in the period that we cover. However, external factors changed somewhat when it came to both systems, which we'll see as well. So the fundamental problem which both geared turbines and turboelectric drive tries to solve is the efficient cruising speed of turbines themselves. Because you see, turbines work quite efficiently at quite a high RPM. But below that, or if you really push them much above that, your fuel efficiency drops off dramatically. The problem is, of course, that one, ships don't travel at constant speed, and two, the efficient spinning speed of a turbine is much, 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 much faster than the efficient spinning speed of a screw propeller. Indeed, if you had a screw propeller directly linked to a turbine and managed somehow to run up to a rotation rate that the turbine was really happy with, you'd probably just end up with a massive amount of cavitation and not a huge amount of forward movement at all. So somehow you have to translate that into a lower speed of rotation to get your ship moving. Now, obviously, a geared turbine does that by massive physical mechanical gearing, so it just steps down your rotation. So that means you can control the rotation of your turbine but still keep it relatively quick, and you can vary the speed of your propeller. Whereas with a turboelectric drive, you use your turbine to turn a generator, which generates electricity, which goes into an electrical motor, or motors, and each motor turns your propeller. Now, the advantages of turboelectric drive are that it allows you to compartmentalize your machinery spaces a little bit more easily, because you can position the motors at your drive shafts, and all you need to connect those motors to the generators and the turbines and the boilers are some electrical cables, which is, something that's much easier to pass through bulkheads and seal up properly, as compared to with geared turbines, where you have to have the gearing right next to the propeller shaft and attached to it, and the turbines directly attached to that, and then the turbines have to be connected to the boilers, and if the boilers and the turbines are all in the same space nice and close, then that's a huge vulnerability to your ship. If you space them out, then you've got loads of steam piping that you need to connect, and obviously potential loss of energy getting to the turbines. And if you have a boiler and a turbine pair in a single compartment, then that's forcing you to position your entire machinery plant in a very specific part of the ship, even if it's all compartmentalized, which may not be ideal from a trim perspective. Turboelectric drive does also allow you to make more efficient use of the power output at the shaft, because you can obviously just dial up and down the amount of power going into the motor, and it also makes it much easier for you to reverse the propeller, because you can reverse a geared turbine system either by slowing down the entire system, stopping and putting it in reverse using a reverse turbine, or you can declutch the gearing and use a reverse set of gearing. And yeah, for those people who way back in one of the early dry docks said, oh, you can't declutch and change gears on a geared ship, and you can't therefore strip the gearing on a geared ship, you don't know what you're talking about, I invite you to go to HMS Belfast into the engine room, and you'll find a rather large set of dials which are rather prominently labelled clutch, along with instructions that you do not declutch the geared turbine system of Belfast until the RPM is below a certain amount. But on a geared turbine system, you need all of that apparatus, whereas on a turboelectric drive system, you need a switch and a couple of dials. And all this while your turbine can be just running at a single optimal speed all the time. The other thing with the turboelectric drive is that if you take a hit that disrupts power between the generators and your motors, as long as the motors themselves are still intact, you can just divert power from other generators to keep all your propeller shafts running, obviously up to a certain point. At some point your power generation will fall below the capacity to supply power to equally at full speed to all of your drive systems. So you might be thinking, well, at that point, why didn't everybody else jump on the turboelectric bandwagon? Well, there are a few issues with the turboelectric drive system. Firstly, of course, it involves an awful lot of high voltage electricity. Now, of course, ships by this period have a lot of high voltage electricity running around them generally, but high voltage electricity as your primary drive system deep in the ship, whilst having your turbines submerged in water and your gearing submerged in water is not ideal. The fact is that unless the rather thick casings on your turbines and gearing get submerged in water, you can actually to a certain extent have a certain amount of flooding in your aft machinery sections, and the ship can still happily motor on, even if a lot of the other stuff around is damaged. And in fact, because of the pressure of the steam, even if you have shrapnel damage to steam pipes, as long as that is in and of itself leaking enough steam to depower your engines, if it floods, the steam will just flood out into the water, in fact probably slightly less due to the pressure, as opposed to into the atmosphere. Whereas if your electrical motor room, which generally the motors won't be in quite as thick a casing anyway because they don't need to be held under massive amounts of pressure, but if your motor room is breached and the motors are exposed, or shrapnel damage has damaged power cabling, yeah, that's not a good place to be. Another problem is, technically speaking, overall efficiency, because you're looking at two different kinds of efficiency. You're looking at the turbine is running at its optimal speed, therefore it's producing the maximum amount of power for the minimum amount of fuel. You can then utilize that power, a high amount of power, with a relative degree of efficiency for what you want to do with the ship. Do you want to go fast? Do you want to go slow? Do you want to go in reverse, etc.? That kind of efficiency. But technically speaking, from a pure energy input versus energy output perspective, the turboelectric drive is actually slightly less efficient than a geared turbine system, because in both cases you start off with chemical energy, or chemical potential energy, which is your fuel. You are then turning that into thermal energy by burning it. That thermal energy is obviously then being transferred into the water in your boilers. That is then obviously becoming thermal and kinetic energy because the steam is moving through the system, and it's getting to the turbines, where the turbines turn that, temperature, pressure, and, passage of the steam into kinetic rotational energy as the turbine spins. Now, with a geared turbine system, and obviously, at each stage there is an energy loss because no system is 100% inefficient. So at that stage, you have had, approximately speaking, the same amount of efficiency per step, except, of course, with the geared turbine, if it's not operating at optimum speed, it might be slightly more or less. But then with the geared turbine, that rotational energy goes into the gearing, and there's not a huge amount of energy lost in the gearing itself to friction and so forth, because it tends to be very well lubricated, and it's remaining as rotational kinetic energy being transferred to the propeller shaft, which is transferred to the propeller and makes the ship go. Whereas with the turboelectric drive, once you've got to the point where you have the turbine rotating, instead of going to the gearing, it's going to a generator, which is transforming that energy once again from rotational kinetic energy into electrical energy. That electrical energy is then being transmitted along cables, which obviously there's going to be resistance and build-up of heat. So there's going to be heat energy losses, resistance losses, because the resistance causes heat, etc. Then that electrical energy is being turned into a magnetic field energy in the motors, which is then being turned back into rotational energy for the propeller shaft, and then it's going down the propeller shaft to the propeller. So there's more stages where energy can be lost. So if a geared turbine system is running at its optimal rotational speed, and the ship is there running at whatever speed through the water via the gearing that it equates to, and a ship next to it is running at exactly the same speed using exactly the same turbines but using turboelectric drive, at that stage the geared turbine ship will be actually more fuel efficient than the turboelectric ship. It's just that outside of that, the savings in efficiency that you make by having the turbine on the turboelectric ship continuously running at that optimal speed versus the geared turbine ship, which has to vary its rotational speed, that's where the turboelectric drive starts to pull ahead the further away you get from that ideal rotational point. The other big downside, and probably the single biggest downside of the turboelectric drive, is that because you've got these additional transformations of energy, additional equipment, etc., it takes up more weight and more space than the equivalent geared turbine system. And that was pretty much the downfall of the turboelectric drive, because especially once it came to the treaty system, if you wanted a ship to go at a certain speed, then you could do that with a smaller and lighter geared turbine system, which meant you could put more weight and more space towards ammunition, armor, guns, etc., all the other stuff that you'd have on a warship. And if you were in a peacetime situation where you didn't really mind paying that a little bit extra to have that little bit larger ship for a similar capability, that was fine. But as soon as you're on hard displacement limits, building a turboelectric drive ship that could do 21 or 23 knots or whatever figure of knots you wanted, you were always going to end up, if you had a maximum displacement and you could only build up to that, you were going to have to sacrifice something else, whether that be your protection, your firepower, or whatever. And that meant that turboelectric drive was disadvantageous in a treaty environment, and so it stopped being used, and the geared turbine essentially dominated. Yoko Harakaze asks, I recently got into watching some old BBC documentaries from the 1970s on YouTube, including Secret War, when secrets were starting to be declassified and then talked about. In episode 5 of the series, the various advanced technologies of the Germans are talked about, including at 22:52, that's 22 minutes 52 seconds on the video, a range of jet and rocket-powered anti-shipping boats with a short clip of a rocket-powered boat shown. The narrator briefly mentions that although the design did not go into action, a converted E-boat did. And I was wondering, could you talk about these various designs and about the conversion that went into action, as I can't seem to find anything about it? Well, I mean, that is in and of itself the subject of a whole Wednesday video. I mean, let us know in the comments below if you want to see a rather fun Wednesday video about the madcap projects that the Germans had with their late war E-boat designs, because, yeah, they had some really special ideas, and both rocket and turbojet powered E-boats. Yeah, this wasn't a one-off. This was here are about half a dozen different fully sketched up designs that they were thinking of trying to do, on top of the regular E-boats, advances on the regular E-boats, and hydrofoil E-boats using regular engines, and hydrofoil turbojet powered E-boats. So yeah, I think that could be a fun episode, considering I do actually have the material to talk about that in a reasonable degree of detail. Now, as far as the documentary, I had a quick look, and that was talking about essentially rocket-propelled versions of the Italian human-piloted but ejectable from boats that, like, they used to sink HMS York, but these ones were unmanned, radio-controlled, basically almost surface rocket-propelled torpedoes at that stage. Now, I can't find any record, at least in the material that I've got, that covers all these various madcap ideas, that a modified E-boat powered by rockets or jets actually went into combat. But I did find records about this particular wonderful vessel, and if you think that looks like a powerboat with a pulse jet stolen from a V1 stuck on top of it, yeah, that's pretty much what it is. It's a small E-boat with a V1 style pulse jet rocket-jet motor stuck on it. Some diagrams label this as an actual turbojet. Some diagrams, essentially say, yeah, it's a seagoing V1, and others suggest that maybe both variants existed. But what is known is that a vessel that looked like this, powered by some form of jet propulsion, named Tornado, was tested in the closing stages of the war, and essentially got to a point where it was effectively ready for production or ready for deployment, but it was then destroyed because the Russian advance into Eastern Europe threatened its capture. But trust me, this is the sane version. The slightly more insane versions have some almost UFO-like jet-powered flying squashed pancake things stuck on hydrofoils, which was supposed to motor on through the water at, 65 to 100 plus knots. Not entirely sure what they were supposed to do at the other end, considering you'd have to slow down to launch torpedoes or whatever, but there you go. Coneled asks, you've said before that you need exponentially more power to get speed in the higher speed regimens, so assuming you wanted to design a semi-practical cruiser or battleship-sized vessel capable of 40 knots so that nothing can get away from it, armed with at least 15-inch guns, is that possible using interwar or World War II era technology, ignoring treaty or displacement limits? And if so, what would it look like? Would you need to go to the size of Yamato? Now, there's an interesting question. Could you do it? Okay, well, let's run some of the basics to see whether it's even in the realm of plausibility. First thing, hull speed. You're going to need to have a hull at round about 900 foot long just to get your hull speed in the region of 40 knots, because that's 1.34 multiplied by the square root of the length of the hull in feet. But your energy required to reach a given amount of speed as you approach hull speed is going to get more and more and more to an absurd degree, so you probably don't want that. You are going to need a longer hull. I would say you're probably going to need a hull around about 1,200 foot long, which would give you a hull speed of just over 46 knots, which means that, 6 knot at the top end as you approach hull speed you don't need to get into, so your power, that's dropping your overall power requirements actually a reasonable amount. And also, stick a transom stern on there to give you a bit more effective hull length. So a 1,200 foot long transom hulled vessel is a starter. So we're already talking about a hull that is around about 100 foot longer than the old nuclear-powered CVN-65 USS Enterprise, a hull that's going to be around about just under 350 foot longer than an Iowa-class battleship, or a hull that's just over twice the waterline hull length of USS Texas, or just under twice the waterline hull length of HMS Warspite. Now, can we build something that size? Yeah, probably we can, actually. There were various liners at around about 1,100 feet being built in the 1930s, so building a 1,200 foot hull is certainly not out of the question. It's within the physical capabilities of ship construction technology of this period. Unfortunately, the next stage is a bit trickier: power density. Now, I don't have access to full-scale, large-scale ship modelling software to tell you exactly what the power requirements would be, but I can tell you that we're going to have to build a very fine hull, so more destroyer-like than battleship-like, but that's fine. There are some fairly sleek and slim battleships out there. The problem is going to come with that aforementioned overall power density, because if you look at ships that were able to push 40 knots, like the Abdiel class mine layers, the Mogador class destroyers, they have an approximate power output, so shaft horsepower to ton ratio of between 27 and 30 shaft horsepower per ton. Now, if you take some fairly rapid capital ships, like Hood, Iowa, Richelieu, the G3 class battle cruisers, you start to notice a bit of a trend. The two battleships there, Richelieu and Iowa, have just over 4 shaft horsepower per ton. Iowa's the highest at 4.4, to get up to their top speeds of 32, 33 knots officially. Obviously, could probably do a little bit more than that. And Hood and G3, they're battle cruisers, but they both, I think, are officially a knot slower than Iowa, or thereabouts. G3 probably maybe about the same speed, but they're within shouting distance of Richelieu. But with battle cruiser style hulls as opposed to battleship style hulls, Hood only needed about 3.1 shaft horsepower per ton to reach her maximum top speed, and G3 was calculated, or obviously never built, for 3.3 shaft horsepower per ton. So that gives you some idea of, the difference that both just a knot of speed, but also the different type of hull can make. But since the most energy dense hull is Iowa with 4.4 shaft horsepower per ton, let's look at her power plant. Now, assuming we don't want to widen the beam too much, and we probably don't, certainly not enough to fit massive amounts of extra machinery in, because we want a really slim length to breadth ratio, Iowa is looking at around about 250 foot of machinery space, and that's roughly evenly split between boilers and engines, the turbines themselves. Now, assuming we have arbitrarily strong turbines, which can actually take this amount of power, which is going to be an interesting one, but nonetheless, that means if we're just looking in terms of boiler space, we've got 125 foot of boiler space generating our 212,000 shaft horsepower. Now, of course, again, in theory, assuming we can find some arbitrarily strong turbines, we don't need to duplicate the turbines, we just need to duplicate the boilers. And each boiler set, for which we need 30 to 35 feet, is, in terms of length, assuming we're keeping a constant width, is generating 53,000 shaft horsepower. Unfortunately, even if our additional 350 foot of hull is completely full of boilers, and we remove Iowa's aft turret and magazine space and turn that into another pair of boiler rooms, we max out at just over 900,000 shaft horsepower on our approximately 1,200 foot long hull. And assuming that we armour it more battle cruiser style, and we've just got our 2 turrets up front and then just a really long line of boilers with some engines at the end, we've still only reached a power density of about 13.8, 13.9, assuming that we've got a hull that's maybe 65,000 tons or so. If we use forced circulation machinery off of Richelieu, which is actually even more power dense, even though the power density per ton is less on the battleship, then we can get up to just under 1,300,000 shaft horsepower by extending Richelieu. Unfortunately, that only still buys us about 20 shaft horsepower per ton. So unfortunately, while we'll be going pretty darn quick, in theory, we're not going to quite make it. In fact, I tried running it with all sorts of things. I tried running it with destroyer-grade machinery, cruiser-grade machinery, and whilst that gives you a little bit of a boost, it doesn't give you enough. In the end, the only solution that I could come up with that will give you the power density required to push a ship through the water, even at 1,200 foot long and about 105 to 110 foot wide, at 40 knots, means that you have to use the extremely high density French machinery off a Richelieu class battleship, except you have to build hull as if you're building a cruiser, i.e. no torpedo protection. If you delete the torpedo protection but keep the beam, that gives you enough width of hull to get an additional boiler set in by realigning everything, which increases your overall power factor by about 50%. Now, granted, at this point, you are talking about a ship that has 2 quad 15-inch turrets up front and is then followed by a machinery space that is approximately 450 to 500 foot in length. So you're talking a machinery space about the length of a World War I super dreadnought, and presumably some turbines which can handle 500,000 shaft horsepower each. But yes, if you want a cruiser that can do 40 knots, or in this case, I suppose a battle cruiser, and you build it to cruiser grade standards, you can, in theory, do it. I do not want to imagine what would happen if you tried. But assuming arbitrarily strong turbines, then yes, maybe you just about can. Reva asks, could you talk about the development and significance of water condensers for letting steam engines become useful propulsion for naval craft? Land-based steam engines would usually just resupply rather than condensing, but how far could a ship go without similar? Did they just carry silly amounts of fresh water, use seawater instead, or what? Condensers were a feature on steamships right from the very start. I mean, condensers were first used with some of the very, very earliest Watt steam engines, as in the ones invented by James Watt. The problems with mounting them on steam trains essentially run into size and weight issues on a steam locomotive that's got, a fairly limited amount of space and volume in which to fit everything. There are other issues because of that with the way condensers will work on a steam engine, as in a steam locomotive, but that's neither here nor there. You could, in theory, make a steam locomotive with a condensing system that didn't have the drawbacks that real life ones do, but it would be a much bigger unit that would be considerably more expensive and complex, and that's pretty much why it wasn't done historically. Although condenser steam locomotives do exist, but only for very specific niches where that kind of environment, where the downsides are less important than the requirements that lead to the need for a condenser unit. But again, locomotive historians feel free to chime in with a bit more detail on that one. But yeah, for ships, they've always got a condenser on them, and that's in part because they're so much larger. They'll go through so much water if you don't have a condenser that you'll effectively have you basically won't have range. But by the time a ship has gone through its water supply without any condenser and it's just exchanging it out into the atmosphere, you probably, if you're starting from cold, you probably actually wouldn't get the boilers completely warmed up and ready to go before you ran out of water. Certainly not without, as you mentioned, ridiculous amounts of tankage aboard. Now, there were still losses even with condensers, especially in the era of the marine steam engine, or basically the piston-powered engine, like you can see here, which eventually would lead to the double and then the triple expansion engine, because you'd get steam, well, you get steam leaks from the cylinders, the pistons, hot water and steam coming out, plus a degree of contaminated water. There's with lubricant and stuff. There's only so much you can do to filter that, and this is why onboard water distillation plants come about pretty much at the same time that steam power really becomes a broad fixture aboard warships with the advent of the ironclad era. Of course, there have been steam-powered ships before that, but it tends to be more auxiliary. As you get into the ironclad era, obviously steam becomes more and more and more of a ship's propulsion system, and because of the incremental losses in the amount of water aboard a ship, the distillation allows you to top that up. In absolute extremis, yes, you can use seawater, but you're going to foul your boilers up really fast doing that. One of the added attractions of steam turbine-driven ships was that because they didn't use up as much water, as in they didn't need quite as much topping up, it meant that either you could have the same amount of distillation aboard and have more fresh water available for crew amenities, or you could reduce your distillation plant and keep the same amount of crew amenities, which allow you to put other things in there. Grummancat asks, can you tell us more about this character who was running HMS Canopus's engine room in the lead up to Coronel? I'm having a hard time understanding how someone in his state can go so long without the commanding officer knowing. For that matter, what was the nature of his behaviour? Did everyone else in the engine room feel unable to alert the command staff, or did they fear insubordination? I'm familiar with the concept of oil and water and engineers not mixing with the command crew, but surely this was a matter of dire import to the safety of the ship. Well, from what can be gleaned from the first-hand reports of Canopus's voyage, as I mentioned in previous videos, what had essentially happened was the chief engineer had shut himself in his cabin, refused to have anything to do with the engineering plant, and was almost, but not quite, reduced to communicating via letter with everybody else. Of course, there are runners and so forth, but essentially what it meant was he was just convincing himself of further and further problems with Canopus's engine rooms, and he was issuing orders to that effect, i.e., don't run past this speed and don't do this thing because otherwise everything's going to go wrong. And then when it came to submitting reports to the captain, and bear in mind, the captain of Canopus is at this point trying to get a ship that was until relatively recently in reserve, prepared for battle, imminent battle, and is going through the process of actually having to navigate his ship through some of the more dangerous waters, and is obviously relying on his crew to all do their job. So if the chief engineer is either sending him messages or very occasionally possibly showing up and saying the ship can only do X, then the captain's going to have to take him at his word for that. And so he's only going to order the, whatever speed the chief engineer that day has decided Canopus is capable of doing. And at the other end, the subordinates, well, it's not the subordinates' place to talk to the captain or the first officer. They submit their reports up the chain of command to the chief engineer, and he takes what they've said and communicates it to the captain. And of course, as I mentioned, there were a few minor issues with Canopus's engineering plant, but they were fixable issues that, after the chief engineer's relief, were able to bring Canopus back up to a pretty decent speed, certainly a speed that would have allowed her to be useful to Craddock, or at least keep company with Craddock. Of course, whether or not that would have been a useful thing is another matter entirely, but Admiral von Spee certainly seemed to have thought that would have been a rather decisive change in Craddock's lineup. And so, of course, if the rest of the engineering crew are telling the chief engineer, well, we have some issues with the ship, but, this is what we think we can do, and then they're getting orders down, 12, 13 knots or so, the crew down in the engineering spaces, they don't know, really, the overall tactical situation. They know they're supposed to be making their way toward Admiral Craddock's squadron, but outside of maybe rumour, they're not necessarily going to know that Craddock is about to engage the enemy, that he's so many hundreds of miles ahead of them, and so on and so forth. So it's just a general lack of information all around, that maybe if that information had been not present, what would be the correct word? If the various people who aren't the chief engineer in the engineering department had been aware of the overall situation, then they might have spoken up a little bit sooner than they did, and historically it did take someone speaking up to eventually get everything sorted out. But, you know, this is the problem with a hierarchical command structure. It relies on every link in the chain being sound. Otherwise, you end up with massive redundancy and oversight, which you can't really afford in a warship. You can have some, but at certain critical links, like the chief of departments, you can't really have two of them. And that's basically the fundamental issue with poor old Canopus. My Mum's Basement Needs More Windows asks, in a recent Drydock you discussed the prefix conventions for ships of various navies, including the de jure, like HMS for the Royal Navy, and the de facto, DKM or KMS for the Kriegsmarine. What is the modern convention for English ships during the Interregnum or Commonwealth or Republican period, and what was used at the time? So, technically speaking, HMS, which was also briefly HBMS, His Britannic Majesty's ship, which is a bit clumsy, technically that only actually comes about with the Restoration, which immediately follows the Interregnum, Commonwealth, whatever you want to call it. So, very technically speaking, HMS only applies after that point, and prior to that, which would include this period, Royal Navy ships, well, ships belonging to the state of England at that point in time, didn't actually officially have prefixes. This is why when you see Elizabethan ships, like in the Armada, they're usually referred to as the Triumph, the Ark Royal, the Revenge, etc. So using HMS Revenge for Drake's Revenge in the Armada is both anachronistic and actually also technically incorrect, because Revenge did not belong to the Crown. It was a private vessel. HMS Ark Royal, back at the Armada, would be anachronistic, but in theory kind of may be acceptable because it was at least a Crown vessel, but it's usually just referred to as the Ark Royal. And the same way Sovereign of the Seas, as you can see here, is properly just Sovereign of the Seas. Again, if you want to be slightly anachronistic, you can use HMS Sovereign of the Seas. But for the period that Cromwell and Parliament are solely in charge, as far as I'm aware, nobody's actually come up with a de facto prefix convention for that period. I guess it might be like Commonwealth ship, CS, if you wanted to do it, something like that. But I don't think anyone's ever really going to bother. Excelsior1 asks, so you have a ship on a slipway, let's say King George V class battleship. How long is it on the slipway before being pushed out for final completion? How much of the ship is finished? Are the keel and ribs plus hull plating all there is? Is the power plant there? If not, are the propeller shafts in place so that it's watertight? Does it have interior armour installed, etc., etc.? When you're looking at a treaty battleship, you're usually looking at about 2 years between keel laying and launch, give or take a little bit, but that's usually fairly consistent unless you have other circumstances like war getting involved that may shorten or indeed lengthen it. Here's a picture of King George V on launch, which gives you some idea of roughly how complete she is. So you can see the bases of the superstructure are in place, but not the masts and not the upper portions of the tower, etc. You can also see the barbettes for the secondary battery are in there, The armour plate, however, you can see is not the external armour plate. The deck armour will be in place because they will have had to construct decks above that, as will be the barbette armour, because the barbette and its roller bearings, for the most part, will be installed. The machinery will be installed in this particular case. Most ships would be launched with their machinery in place. The propeller shafts will be in place, but the propellers themselves usually aren't fitted. They would be fitted during the fitting out phase. If a ship has internal hull plating, like an Iowa class, that probably will be in place before it gets launched. So to complete it, there'll be some final work done on the barbettes and roller paths, and then the installation of the turrets, the building up of the rest of the superstructure, masts where appropriate, secondary battery, anti-aircraft battery, anchors, chains, that kind of thing. And in terms of, are cruisers and destroyers more complete when they leave the slipways? Cruisers usually aren't. Cruisers are usually in about the same state. Destroyers, proportionally speaking, will usually have more of their superstructure in place, but that tends to be because destroyers are so much smaller, so just installing the basic superstructure for a destroyer actually pretty much almost completes the bulk of that work. But in broad terms, the main armament, the finishing to the superstructure, the propeller blades, and so forth, that's pretty much commonly all fitting out stuff. Graf Spee Minister asks, was there a special Christmas ration for the US or Royal Navy sailor? And what did it look like in the theatres of the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans? Generally speaking, there wouldn't be a regimented difference in the various oceans. Essentially because in the era before refrigeration and, fairly reliable supplies, you would just have whatever it was available. So the captain might go through an effort to find something special for Christmas Day, but if you were on a sailing warship and you'd been on deployment out to, I don't know, the China station for a couple of years, turkeys are a little bit hard to come by in early 19th century China, as are, for that matter, things like potatoes. So you might get fresh food if the captain was feeling quite generous, as opposed to preserved, but that would really be about it. Once you get to preservation being definitely a thing, so refrigerators and freezers and so forth, then things become somewhat easier, because that's just a matter of, well, we know we're deploying now, we know we are most likely still going to be deployed at Christmas time, therefore when we're loading supplies on, just make sure we load on some Christmas type supplies. So, you like to have powdered, which would then be turned into mashed potato most of the time, but you could load on a consignment of whole potatoes, which you could then keep back for a Christmas dinner. And likewise, you'd load on fresh meat, chicken, beef, pork, whatever. You just make sure you maybe got some turkeys as well, and keep them in the freezer for the specific date, and so on and so forth. It wouldn't really vary too much, as I said, between the oceans at that stage, because whilst you might be deploying, you don't strictly have a guarantee as to which ocean you'll be in, particularly for the Royal Navy, if we're talking about World War II. So, you might sail from your last major resupply in, let's say, late October, but in two months' time, you might be in the Atlantic on convoy duty, you might be in the Mediterranean, you might be in the Indian Ocean, you might be in the Pacific. You might have passed through several of those. For the US Navy, it was perhaps a little bit more predictable. You might well be in the Pacific, but as far as I can tell, once they're actually able to start specifically loading ships up for Christmas Day meals, it's basically a case of what is the traditional Christmas Day meal in the home country, and obviously there are some variations to that, and just making sure that they load a meal's worth of that for the crew, and it just stays in the appropriate storage consignment area until it's needed. Peter Guy asks, in 1863, during the US Civil War Battle of Gettysburg, Union General Dan Sickles infamously ignored orders and positioned his Third Corps well ahead of the rest of the Union line. The subsequent Confederate assault on his indefensible position nearly decimated his corps and caused the Union commanding general to have to rush reserves into the line. Putting aside the various adventures at Jutland and whatever hauls he did at the Battle of Samar, can you think of any notable examples of a subordinate commander ignoring orders and opportunistically leading, say, a squadron under his command into a perilous situation for which the enemy promptly chastised him or the rest of the fleet? The funny thing is, with that question, I can't really think of that many examples. There are a number of examples where a subordinate commander either ignores orders or opportunistically attacks against or in spite of or without orders from his superior. But usually those tend to either go well, because either it is actually a good strategy to use, and or because the commanding admiral sends ships to back up the officer rather than risk lose that portion of the fleet. So the Battle of Cape St. Vincent can be seen as something like that, because Nelson's decision to break the line and go after the Spanish with HMS Captain was, broadly speaking, a sound decision to make, but on his own, Captain would have been shot to pieces and taken, and it was only the fact that John Jervis saw what was going on and thought, right, yeah, that's actually a good plan, and sent ships to help Nelson, that turned it from Nelson getting himself and his command killed into an actual, decent victory. And outside of those kinds of situations, usually, and I do stress usually, the subordinate commanders know better than to go charging off without the overall admiral's direct orders. Or if they do, the situation is spotted in time for the person in question to be recalled before they've done anything too bad. However, there are plenty of situations where subordinate commanders have ignored orders and that has led to a battle being lost, even if it's not because they've gone on the offensive. For example, the reason the 4 days battle is up here is that on the fourth day, the last day of the battle, it actually looked like the English fleet was going to win. Spoiler alert, they didn't. And they didn't, largely because just when the Dutch sprang their kind of combination trap and last-ditch effort, and then the English fleet was ready to spring its own, not necessarily trap, because it wasn't really a particularly thought-through tactic, but counter-trap, counter-offensive, I guess, that would have probably sealed the Dutch fleet's fate. Then at that point, the flagship of the portion of the English fleet that was going to spring that counter-trap, the Royal Charles, or was it the Royal James, one of the two? Anyway, it had its masts weakened by previous combat, and those masts then began to collapse under the strain of trying to head off after the Dutch, and the rest of the squadron that was around it decided that, despite the flagship saying, no, you need to go and attack now, they decided, no, we're going to pull back and defend the flagship of our squadron instead, which is pretty much what cost the English that battle, because it left a portion of the English fleet unsupported. But the formation of the line of battle in the Age of Sail broadly was in part specifically to avoid situations like this arising. TXK234 asks, why did the Royal Navy revert HMS Vindictive back to a heavy cruiser instead of doing a full carrier conversion like HMS Furious? Essentially, when Vindictive came back from her initial deployments, well, as you can see, she was essentially an Effingham-Hawkins class heavy cruiser that just hadn't had her main armament fitted and had a superstructure and flight deck kind of built on top and around the existing superstructure. So you can see the funnels are still there amidships, the bridge superstructure is still there. She's got a little flying off platform at the front and a landing platform aft with netting. Actually, in some ways similar to Furious in her second carrier incarnation. However, what they had learned was that, well, from both Vindictive and Furious, was that having the superstructure in the middle, still there in the funnels, didn't work. The turbulence was far too bad for aircraft trying to land. And that meant that if they were going to continue using her as a carrier, they would have to do a full carrier conversion. So retrunk the funnels to one side, have an island, etc. Basically, what it's kind of similar to what they did to Furious. But Vindictive is considerably smaller than Furious, and that means she would be a less effective carrier. It would be therefore quite expensive to convert her for relatively little return. By the time she's actually, brought back and is now placed in reserves, it's the end of 1919, beginning of 1920, and so the Royal Navy's budget has been cut down quite a bit. And whereas Furious, in her cruiser, battle cruiser, whatever you want to call it, configuration, is pretty much useless to the Royal Navy, and therefore to make her useful, a carrier conversion is pretty much the only path to go. With Vindictive, if they just take off the flight decks and associated equipment, they've basically got the hull of a heavy cruiser still there. They can just put her guns back on and get a heavy cruiser out of her. And a heavy cruiser, especially what at that point is the latest generation heavy cruiser, is actually very useful for the Navy. So rather than having an expensive, small, inefficient carrier, having a top-of-the-line, far less expensive to convert heavy cruiser, it seems a much better deal to the Royal Navy at the time. And, of course, once you get into the treaty period a few years later, the Royal Navy needs every single cruiser hull it can possibly get, which kind of, seals the deal. And whilst her dimensions are, relatively similar to HMS Hermes, which obviously is under construction as, the world's first purpose-built carrier in competition with Hosho, separate argument there, I think. The simple fact of the matter is she is a little bit narrower than Hermes, which is not going to help things. Because she's a cruiser, she's got a bigger power plant, which means, yes, she's faster, but it's also taking up more space. And she's always going to have the inefficiency of a conversion. And whilst Hermes was a useful thing, the Royal Navy had already concluded they wanted subsequent carriers to be larger anyway. Torreno asks, it's been mentioned in previous episodes how conning towers were not particularly well-liked features of ships in a lot of navies, and most officers chose to forego them in favour of commanding from the bridge, whilst not also protecting people from inside them due to the concussive force from explosions coming through. My question is, what could have been done to make conning towers a more popular choice to use in battle, and theoretically, if a conning tower had to be capable of protecting anyone or anything placed inside it from absolutely anything likely to be thrown against it, bar the ship sinking or flooding, what armour thickness or alternative materials to protect against shockwaves would be required to achieve this? Okay, I think there's possibly two ways to go about this. Because when it comes to the unpopularity of conning towers, there's a lot of secondary factors, but the two main ones are massively restricted vision and relatively low height. So this is HMS Hood, and you can see there on the right the conning tower, and you can see there on the left the bridge. You get an immediate idea that the bridge can see further and with a better field of view. So visibility is one problem. The survivability is the other issue. Now, to improve visibility, you're in a little bit of a quandary because, of course, the reason the conning tower has these very narrow viewing slits is to minimize the intrusion of direct blast and shrapnel. If you make those larger, so the people in there can see out better, then you're allowing more blast and shrapnel in, which kind of obviates the point of having a conning tower. However, I think there might be a solution. Solution one would be to adopt a cruiser-grade conning tower, something with maybe 6-8 inches of armour, and stick that right up top. Maybe, at the same level as the bridge. At that point, well, you couldn't really put it at the same level as the bridge because it would get in the way, but maybe you could put it one level down from the bridge, or maybe even on top of the bridge. Essentially use the fact you've got a much lighter weight conning tower to move it to a higher vantage point, wherever that happens to be. So that'll give you a longer distance to view because you're higher up. And since it's only 6 to 8 inches of armour, what you could also do is perhaps fill in some of the viewing slits with thick glass. Now that will obviously stop direct blast pressure, hopefully catch some of the shock waves. But the other thing I would do is have it as a kind of slightly, what was the correct term? Not necessarily magnifying, but a slight visual distortion effect to it. Essentially make it a lens such that despite the fact you've got a small viewing slit, it just, have it so it just broadens your field of view a little bit. So at that point, you're still not the same field of view as if you were on the bridge, especially an open bridge, but you've got a better field of view. You're not sacrificing much, if any, height. And the way you do that, as I said, is obviously by sacrificing armour. But to be honest, 6 to 8 inches of armour on the conning tower is going to protect you against a near miss from a big shell. It's going to protect you against shrapnel. It's going to protect you against blast. It's going to protect you against hits from the secondary battery. The only thing it's not going to protect you against is a direct or near direct hit from a main battery gun from a battleship or similar. But as we've already established, doubling the armor on the conning tower isn't probably going to do that either. So, you haven't really lost much. It just means you're going to be killed directly by the shell instead of indirectly. But solution 2, for those who actually definitely want to survive and they're prepared to forego almost everything else to do so, this would be probably one of the few instances where spaced armor is actually worth having on any kind of warship, at least in the early 20th century. So what you would probably want to do, and this is going to make installing conning towers somewhat harder, is you're going to have to use the same thickness, i.e. your 14, 16, 18, whatever inch thick conning tower that can resist incoming battleship shells. But then inside the conning tower, and I think you probably have to go with the optical distortion glass that I mentioned with the previous solution as well for this, you would maybe want to have an air gap and then an inner conning tower, and that inner conning tower would maybe be another 3-4 inches thick. And on top of, because you've got basically a cylinder nested inside a cylinder with a gap in between, on top just shield that with some lightweight plating or something, the gap I mean. And the idea of that would be that when the shell hits the thick armor portion, then the shock wave will travel through, but then obviously it will encounter air, and following the path of least resistance, at least part of the shock wave will blow out through the top of the conning tower, just lifting off those plates. Pretty much similar to how you use a liquid void liquid layer in a torpedo defense system, except you're using a solid system for this. And any shrapnel and spalling from the inside of your conning tower, again, in theory, should be caught by your inner conning tower. And to be honest, I think that's probably the best you could do. It is going to massively complicate the weight of the thing. And with both solutions, you've got to take into account the conning towers usually sit on a sort of barbette-like structure themselves, so that a hit immediately below doesn't just come up and kill everyone from underneath. But honestly, I think that's probably the only way you're going to at least moderate the effects of a direct heavy shell impact. It's going to have problems. You're adding a lot more weight to the conning tower, so stability issues, the weights that goes into that could have gone into other parts of the ship. But it might offer somewhat more survivability than just having the shockwave transmitted directly. The other problem with that, as I said, is that, you've still got the vision slits, and if you have your slight optical distortion lensing, then great. but obviously that's also creating glass which may shrapnel through in the event of a direct hit. So, unfortunately, when it comes to conning towers, that is always going to be a weakness, regardless of all the other problems. That is always going to be a weakness when it comes to early 20th century stuff. Like, nowadays, perhaps you would have multiple distributed sensors, both, standard visual cameras and others, which you could then link through into a conning tower that doesn't have vision slits. But at that point, you've basically reinvented the CIC, which can go down in the armoured portion of the citadel anyway. Farragut, Farragut's Froggagut, Forger, Foraging for Four Forgotten Frogguts for Froggut, Friar, Fair, asks, how often were carrier pigeons used by the age of sail ships for communications, and considering their effectiveness later on, do you think they should have been more widely used? I can't see a tremendous amount of evidence that carrier pigeons were used in the age of sail, at least by navies like the Royal Navy, French Navy, Spanish Navy, etc. They seem to be used, but used on land for the most part. And then their use at sea seems to be mostly a late 19th century thing, by which point we're well out of the age of sail. Should they have been more widely used? Possibly. The only problem I think that you would have is that they wouldn't be useful across the fleet for all purposes, because the pigeons, they go back to their home. So they can only fly so far, especially at sea. Now, if perhaps you're in the Channel Fleet, that might work, because there's not a huge amount of distance to fly back to Portsmouth or Plymouth or wherever. But, to be perfectly honest, most of the time, if you're in the Channel Fleet, the difference between releasing a pigeon, which admittedly will get home faster, or sending a messenger packet back, is not massively different. If you start to venture out much further, then I think you're going to run into two issues. One is that, as I said, the pigeons return home. I don't know a huge amount about racing pigeons or homing pigeons, but I would suspect that if you took a pigeon out to sea for months at a time, it may well start to think of the ship as its home. I don't know how good pigeons' memory is, but that could be a problem. But even if it's not a problem, even if they somehow maintain a connection to their home, even if they've maybe spent more of their life aboard the ship than in their home coop, it's still a relatively short-range communications measure, and at those ranges, as I said, there are already messenger units in place. Once you go out, to the Caribbean, having a pigeon whose home is in Southampton, it really isn't going to help in the slightest. I suppose you could keep picking up and shuttling around pigeons, but then you've got to have a whole extra layer of infrastructure of, okay, well, this ship was blockading the French squadron at Brest, where a carrier pigeon that goes back to the UK might be useful. Well, now orders have come that say this ship now needs to go and help out in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean or the Mediterranean. Well, now whoever's brought that message has to go back and take home or transfer to other ships in the fleet the pigeons that were on that ship. The ship then has to go to its new assignment and hope there are some presumably carrier pigeons that have homes in Port Royal or Bombay, as it was at the time, or something like that, which seems like an awful lot of bother. Again, for a bird that, after it's spent most of its life at sea before it needs to be used, may not actually do what you want it to do in the end. But in very limited circumstances, I can see pigeons being quite useful. So if you know that you're heading out for a battle relatively close to home, and you want some way of either calling for reinforcements or even letting people know that the battle's been lost and they should prepare for the consequences of that, then I can see a use for carrier pigeons or homing pigeons. But that would be the kind of thing, like the Anglo-Dutch Wars, or the Battle of Camperdown or something like that, where you are deploying from port You're not going on blockade duty, you're going over to attack a specific formation of enemy warships, take some carrier pigeons with you, get the news back nice and quick, whatever that news happens to be. Chase Cogburn asks, in video games we see ships, including battleships, use hydrophones and sonar to detect torpedoes. How often did this actually happen, and did battleships have these systems in place? I would think battleships are a bit too big to use sonar and hydrophones effectively. I'm not aware of any battleship in the time period covered fitted with sonar for active duty use. So, no, is the answer to that half the question. And apart from anything, with the best will in the world, post-World War I and then World War II Aztec sonar systems, you have issues detecting submarines, detecting as torpedo. You might get lucky, but I really wouldn't count on it. And some battleships, however, were fitted with hydrophones. So yes, that part, yeah, they were. Not all of them, but there are a few. Musashi, for instance, is a rather large example. However, the problem with those is that essentially the hydrophone works on the same principle as, take your pick, passive sonar. So you listen for things. Slight problem with battleships when it comes to using torpedoes to detect sonar, so when using hydrophones to detect torpedoes, I should say, I don't know how I managed to mess those words up, but anyway, is that the hydrophones don't work because of water flow noise if you're going at any particularly high speed, which means that yes, in theory, you could use your hydrophones to detect a submarine or torpedoes coming in. However, if you did so, your battleship would of necessity be either stationary or, in all practical terms, almost stationary, which is the single worst place to be when you're being shot at by torpedoes, because you're not going to really be able to accelerate out of that particularly quickly, certainly not by the standards of the incoming torpedoes. Which means at that point the hydrophone system is more of a, hey guys, any really, really fast last wills and testaments you want to fill out? As opposed to any kind of particularly useful feature. If you're moving at speed, which is the battleship's best defense against torpedoes, because it broadens the firing solutions and gives you the ability to maneuver, your hydrophones aren't going to tell you anything. Now, there is a sort of intermediate point where you could be traveling at medium speeds and get some data. And we know, for example, that Prince Eugen's, although she's a heavy cruiser, her hydrophones picked up the sounds of the propellers at Prince of Wales and Hood motoring their way through the water at quite a long distance. But there is a little bit of a difference between, 4 massive propellers, each on 35 to 45,000 ton capital ships, and a dinky little, 1 to 2 foot propeller on a torpedo. So, yes, you can use hydrophones, but there's going to be very limited applications for it. Joshua Dworkin asks, when discussing the Barden trials, you mentioned that the test data showed the breech-loading 15-inch 42 actually demonstrated considerably more armour penetration capability than even the designers of the gun expected it would have when accounting for range and plunging fire. I have 2 questions related to this. 1. Are there other gun designs that are known to have punched above their design characteristics, perhaps the Italian high-velocity 12 inches, etc.? And 2, would the Barden test seem to indicate that, in general, heavy naval artillery will exceed its design penetration specifications, and therefore most ship designs are actually probably under-armoured against the weapon that they thought they were protected against? With regards to the first question, yes, there are some gun designs that are known to have performed considerably above design specification. For exactly which ones they are, I think I'd probably have to do a Wednesday video, maybe looking at something like maybe 3 or 4 guns that really, really overperformed, and maybe 3 or 4 that were disappointments in service, to fully explain why and exactly which ones, because of course there were a lot of different naval guns. And sometimes guns would underperform in some tests, and then they'd figure out why, and they change something, and that would switch things around, and the gun would actually then overperform because you changed some kind of characteristic or parameter. And that's not necessarily immediately. It could be a case of, well, we designed the gun to penetrate, let's say, 12 inches of armor at 10,000 yards. It only penetrates 10. This is disappointing, but it's the best that we've got. And then 5 years down the line, someone goes, aha, I have the solution. And suddenly it now penetrates 13 inches of armor at 10,000 yards. And all sorts of things in between. So unfortunately, I can't give you specific guns right now, but perhaps in a future video I will, and in considerable detail. But with the second question, in general, will naval heavy artillery perform better than design spec? I wouldn't say that the Barden tests show that particularly. For one thing, the 15-inch 42 was a little bit of a rush design, and it's one of those rather weird things where, by all accounts, the amount of rushing that went into it theoretically should mean it wouldn't work, and it's a 42 caliber gun, which by rule of thumb is a little bit short, but it just seems to have turned out to be a really, really good gun, to the point that whilst it's not, absolute top of the line, as in my naval guns video, it's not top rate competing with 16 and 18-inch guns, shockingly enough, in World War II. It's still competitive generally, and especially in the admittedly theoretical use of supercharges, especially from something like Vanguard, it would actually still have a very creditable performance. But the 15-inch 42 also has quite a lot of development in its shell types, and the Barden tests at the end of, just after the end of World War I, sorry, they are not just testing the 15-inch 42 generally, they're also testing the 15-inch 42 with a considerably improved shells compared to the ones it entered service with. So the design specifications for the 15-inch 42 firing its initial shells would obviously be exceeded using the new Green Boy shells, but that's not necessarily in and of itself a dramatic revelation. The degree to which it did so is another matter. But then, it's a whole new shell type essentially being introduced compared to the older types, so you're entering a little bit of unknown territory at this point. One of the other problems as well is you can get confirmation bias. I think that's probably the right term. It's not precise, but hopefully you'll see what I mean. In that most navies generally won't share their armor materials with other people for people to shoot at for rather obvious reasons, which means that outside of the early part of the age of armor, back in the 1860s, 1870s, where you could actually relatively easily get your hands on other people's armor plate, by the early 20th century, you're going to be testing your weapons against your own armor. Now, that's a reasonably decent rule of thumb and should give you some ideas about roughly how much armor protection you need. And you can develop your own formulas based on that. However, it does come with a rather big caveat that it's against your armor. So somebody else might have a slightly different mix of trace elements that are going into their steel, so their steel might have different properties. They will almost certainly have a different level of face hardening as well, so it's not only different material, but in terms of the molecular structure and the makeup of it, but also the actual, the layering of the hard face and the soft face and the transition between the two and how thick each of them is proportional to the other. That's all going to be different. So 12 inches of Class A US armor manufactured in 1938 compared to 12 inches of face-hardened armor manufactured in the UK in 1938 compared to exactly the same thickness of armor from Germany, France, Russia, if they can, Japan, etc. They're all going to have slightly different performance characteristics, and the Barden armor penetration trials, whilst they are obviously good for the 15-inch 42 and its new shell, they are also somewhat of a judgment against elements of how the Germans designed their battleship armour in World War One. So if you took that same test and you substituted Nevada for Baden, or Britannia for Baden, or Fuso or Ise for Baden, whilst I think you would still get surprisingly good results out of the 15-inch 42 compared to what you'd expect, you will get different results on penetration from each of those ships, even if you can find something roughly similar in terms of armour thickness on each ship to shoot at. Now, of course, that means that if you're lucky enough to be one of the nations that has really, really good battleship armour, and you test against yours, then shooting against almost everyone else, you should get better results than you would expect, which is good. But you don't necessarily know whether you're at the top of the table or not. If you're mid-level in the table, you're going to get some results shooting at people which are what you expect. Shoot at other people, you'll get considerably worse results, and shoot at other people, and you'll still get somewhat better results. And then on top of that, you've got the fact that different shells perform at in different ways at different angles of attack. So you can't usually just take one shell and another within shouting distance of each other in terms of muzzle velocity and so forth, and say this one is definitively better, this one is definitively worse. Sometimes that is the case, but often when it's a competitive environment, you'll find that the one shell performs better in one regiment and the other shell performs better in another. So, for example, if you take the 14-inch gun, when the US Navy did testing of the British 14-inch gun found on the King George V's and the upgraded and modernised 14-inch guns that you found on some of the standard class, they discovered a rather interesting phenomena, which was that if the shell was hitting at close to perpendicular, i.e. when it was flat on, the British shell was marginally better than the American shell in terms of absolute penetration. But then when it came time to detonate, the fact that British shell was achieving that penetration with a considerably higher bursting charge meant that in the US Navy's own rating, it made the British 14-inch shell striking at a near perpendicular angle or close to it a much better shell, because it was going to do considerably more damage, displace considerably more material, potentially even break a hole through the armor plate, even if the direct penetration hadn't been able to do so. If you got, let's say, 14 inches of plate, the shell gets through 12 inches, then explodes, it might blow that last 2 inches out in shrapnel, etc. So you now actually have a hole and a bunch of shrapnel going through, whereas potentially the American shell wouldn't. I mean, at 2 inches it probably would, but you get the general drift of the idea. But on the other hand, they found that if you were hitting at a more oblique angle, i.e., a shell falling at very long range, or the angle between the ships is quite high, then the American shell did better in just absolute penetration, whereas the British shell obviously was now inferior in performance. So you've got two 14-inch shells firing at the same target, but one does better in one regiment, the other does better in another. Brett McDowell asks, could you talk a little bit about HMS Diamond Rock and its somewhat unusual construction? Seems to be one of the more unusual ships of history. Yeah, so Diamond Rock is near Martinique, which is over in the West Indies, aka the Caribbean. And, well, there was a British vessel that was poking around, because Martinique at the time was held by the French, and having taken a prize and discovered this rock was pretty defensible. I mean, there's only one place to land, it had caves, it had a nice pinnacle, etc. Rather enterprisingly, he decided to land, put a garrison of men down there, and using ropes and pulleys and so forth, haul up some cannon and carronades to various levels, and then with a couple of small craft attached to it for supplies and reconnaissance, it was then commissioned as a frigate as HMS Diamond Rock, because the rock was Diamond Rock. Now, that was partly just a little bit of fun, but partly also it meant that as a technically commissioned vessel, you could assign crew to it, and the Navy would have to keep it with supplies and with a command staff of officers, etc., etc. Whereas you know, as far as I can tell, it seems to be one of those things where, although the Royal Navy did staff garrisons in some places, most of the time garrisoning was left to the Army. The Navy wanted control of Diamond Rock and wanted to retain control of Diamond Rock, and to be honest, the Army may not have been too interested, because Diamond Rock's main advantage was that it could essentially perform a one-ship, quote-unquote, blockade of Martinique from its position overlooking the safe approaches. And by commissioning it as a ship in the Royal Navy, it meant that officially, the Royal Navy isn't garrisoning a rock somewhere out in the middle of the Caribbean. It's just a ship that doesn't move very much and therefore falls under naval jurisdiction. It then managed to hold off the French for a while. Then the French eventually took it, which is what's depicted here, with a rather large fleet, considering the poor old island had less than a dozen guns total. And then the British recaptured it when they retook Martinique later in the Napoleonic Wars. And then at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, they gave Martinique back to the French again. And it's kind of stayed in French, it stayed in French hands thereafter for the period that the Channel covers. Although there's not a huge amount of indication that the French ever fortified Diamond Rock afterwards. And this kind of polite fiction of commissioning various land installations as ships so that they are properly within the purview of the Navy is not unique to Diamond Rock, although it's a relatively unusual occurrence, generally speaking, but multiple navies have done so. And then in the latter part of the period the Channel covers in the early 20th century, unfortunately, bureaucracy actually did something sane for a change and decided that, yes, the Navy could have fortifications and man them. And that meant, unfortunately, the practice of commissioning various bits of geography into the Royal Navy or the US Navy or whoever had to go by the wayside, and now we have schools and so forth named, technically in commission, with HMS or whatever, depending on your nation, appended to them, which, whilst a fine tradition, is somewhat less exciting than arming random bits of the landscape and pretending that they are ships. Vauquier asks, how big of a gap in capability is there between the best pre-dreadnought and the worst dreadnought? Well, the problem is you've got to define what is the best pre-dreadnought and the worst dreadnought to start with. Now, for the worst dreadnought, I would say that's a relatively easy one. Sorry, Spain, the Spaniards are getting that particular title. They've got the least powerful broadside of any dreadnought. Yes, they have a theoretical broadside of 8 12-inch guns, which is, granted, a little bit more than the 8 11-inch guns of something like the Nassau's. However, unlike the Nassau's, which very definitely can bring 8 guns to bear on a broadside, because the Espanias have a fore-turret, an aft-turret, and 2 offset wing turrets, one on each side, whilst the arcs of clearance are actually not terrible compared to some ships with en-echelon turrets, they're still restricted and you are still going to suffer damage from your own guns firing in that regimen. Whereas if you look at other dreadnoughts that are below 20 knots, like the Nassau's or the South Carolinas, they have a definite 8-gun battery per broadside without that being a problem. And then you compound that with the fact that the Espanias only have 8 inches of belt armor, and they're getting the title of worst dreadnought. Now, best pre-dreadnought, that's a different story. That's a very competitive field. I mean, if you're going to go up against a dreadnought, you probably want to take a semi-dreadnought rather than a pure pre-dreadnought, i.e. 4 main guns into 2 twin turrets and a bunch of medium secondaries. Now, if we take, let's say, the top 6 semi-dreadnoughts, there's 1 or 2 others that can be argued, but the Rozetsky, the Connecticut, the Andrei Pervozvany class, maybe? Russians anyway. Lord Nelson class, Satsuma class, and Danton class. Now, of those, I'm going to eliminate the Rozetsky's relatively quickly because their secondary guns, whilst they're 9.4 inch, quite heavy, there are only 8 of them, which, okay, they're turreted, but it means you only have a 4-gun broadside from your secondaries. And with 9.1 inches of belt armour, they're not particularly well armoured, although they are actually better armoured than the Spaniards. Then the Connecticuts, I think, are probably going to be the next one to go, because whilst they have significantly better armour, 11-inch maximum belt, you're looking again at a maximum 4-gun broadside from your secondary battery, which is 8-inch guns, and then you have another 6 7-inch guns. So although you technically have, in terms of medium to heavy secondary-tertiary batteries, you actually have the most guns with the Connecticuts. The fact that you've got 4 of one caliber and 6 of another so close together, that's really going to mess up your firing solutions. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to eliminate it. Also, at 18 knots, it's not bad for a pre-dreadnought, but it is one of the slower of the semi-dreadnoughts. Now, if the Connecticuts had gone with a uniform 8-inch or uniform 7-inch, the fact that they would be carrying, at that point, 20 guns in their secondary battery, 10 per side, that would have given them a clear, title of best pre-dreadnought, but they didn't, so I'm afraid they're out. The Andrei Pervozvanys, now you're getting slightly more. They have 8-inch guns as well, but they have 4 twins, and they also have another 6 singles, so 3 singles per side. So we're now gone from 4 to 7 guns per side for the secondaries, and it's all uniform, which is good. 18.5 knots, okay, it's workable, but 8.5 inches of belt armor, there are better contenders out there, so I'm afraid I'm going to eliminate those. So that leaves us with the Lord Nelsons, the Satsumas, and the Dantons. The Dantons, by the way, all of these have 2 twin 12 inches, their primary armament. Now we can look at the close competition for the last 3. The Dantons are just over 19 knots. The Satsumas are in roughly the same boat, depending on which ship you're looking at. And the Lord Nelsons are 18 knots. So we kind of got roughly a tie for speed for Danton and Satsuma. Lord Nelson is a little bit behind. Okay, so that's the speed. Now we can look at the protection. Again, relatively quick and crude analysis. The Lord Nelsons have 12 inches on their belt and 8 inches on their secondary guns. The Satsumas have 9 inches on their belt, and, well, yeah, their secondary is not particularly well protected. So, yeah, that's not brilliant. And the Dantons coming there in the middle with 9.8 inches on their belt and pretty well protected turrets. So protection-wise, now the Lord Nelson is on top, Satsuma's on the bottom, Danton's in the middle. And then we look at the secondary batteries themselves. So the Lord Nelsons have 9.2 inch guns. They have 4 twins and 2 singles, which means they're bringing 5 guns to the party on each broadside, and they are all turreted. The Satsumas have 6 twin 10-inch guns, also all in turrets, so they're bringing 6 guns, and they have the heaviest secondary battery at 10-inch, although the difference between 9.2 and 10 and the French 9.4s probably doesn't make huge odds. And the Dantons likewise are bringing 6 twin mountings, all in turrets, so with their 9.4s. So in terms of number of secondaries, the Nelsons are in last place by 1 gun, and the Satsumas and Dantons are tied for the top. So although the Nelsons are the best protected, they have the least secondary broadside, and they are the slowest. So I'm going to eliminate them, and that makes it a face-off between the Satsumas and the Dantons. Now, we've already established they're tied for number of guns in the secondary battery. Performance-wise, 9.4 to 10-inch gun, probably not a huge difference. Speed-wise, which I said they're in the same boat, but the Dantons do have somewhat better protection, which means that by a whisker, I'm going to say that the Dantons are the best pre-dreadnought to go up against España. So now we compare España versus Danton. They've got essentially the same speed characteristics, so one isn't going to really be outrunning the other or outmaneuvering the other. Armour-wise, however, the Dantons have almost 2 inches more belt armour, and they have considerably better turret protection. And as we said, the Espanias, they do have the capability of an 8-gun broadside, but a lot of angles they're probably going to be bringing to bear a 6-gun broadside. But either way, contesting 2 or 4 additional 12-inch guns, because 2 twins on Danton will say match against 2 of the twins on Espana, we have 6 9.4-inch guns, which, they've got the armor penetration to get through Espana's armor. Now, granted, the 12-inch guns are probably going to do a number on Danton if she gets to close or medium close ranges. But the simple fact of the matter is that Danton is going to be throwing out a lot more shells. So she's going to be throwing out 4 12-inch shells and then another 6 9.4-inch shells. And those 9.4-inch guns can fire somewhat faster than the 12-inch guns. And, at the longer ranges, or medium ranges, I should say, beyond sort of the crossover between short and medium, I would say the Dantons actually probably have an advantage at considerable ranges, at the medium-long to long ranges for the time. The Espanias will have the advantage because at some point the 9.4s are going to drop out of contention either completely or as damaging weapons, at which point there's only 4 12-inch guns on one and either 6 or 8 on the other. But at medium, close or close ranges, Danton would actually have an advantage over an Espana, in my belief. Mason asks, in the Second Northern War, in your opinion, what did the Swedes do wrong at the Battle of the Sound, given that they had the slightly larger fleet, and what did the Dutch and the Danes do wrong at Ebeltoft, for that matter? I don't necessarily think the Swedes did a huge amount wrong at the Battle of the Sound, but, there were certain factors that went into the Dutch victory. But honestly, there's not a huge amount I think the Swedes could have done about it in that particular situation. So the 3 main factors that I can see on a tactical level are, 1, although the Swedish fleet is slightly larger, the Dutch fleet on average seems to have slightly larger ships, which is a nice turnabout for the Dutch, given that they just come off the First Anglo-Dutch War, where they'd been on the receiving end of having the fleet that has smaller ships. It's not a huge margin, but it is there. Another factor is that the Dutch fleet has the weather gauge. Now, the Swedish could theoretically have tried to capture the weather gauge, but since the Swedes were blockading, then they necessarily have a slightly more limited range of movements. So you could call that a tactical failure. Perhaps the Swedes could have maneuvered to get the weather gauge, but at the same time, given that there was a Danish fleet nearby, if the Swedes had maneuvered around the Dutch to get the weather gauge over them, the Dutch could potentially then have just gone, okay, fine, we'll go and join up with our friends over there, at which point the combined Danish-Dutch fleet would have had an even greater superiority of numbers and firepower. So a little bit of a catch-22 there for the Swedes. And the other main issue was that at that point, you kind of, in a lot of fights, you have win, draw, or lose. And a win for one side or the other is fairly obvious, a loss is fairly obvious, but an approximate tactical draw can benefit one side or the other. So it depends what that draw would result in. So, if one side has complete dominance of the seas and the other side comes out to fight and it's a draw, that's a net win for the people who have the dominance of the seas because nothing has changed. Whereas, even though it might be a tactical draw, strategically it's a loss for the side that was trying to wrest control of the seas. In this case, because of the blockade, the Swedes' objective was to stop the Dutch getting through. And whilst tactically speaking, both sides pretty much shot each other to pieces, the Dutch went for the Swedes' masts and rigging quite a bit, which, combined with the weather gauge, really hampered the Swedes' ability to operate. Potentially being in 4 squadrons instead of 3 might also have been a small issue, but basically it came down to the fact that in order to win, the Swedes would have had to decisively defeat the Dutch fleet and force it to retreat, whereas in order to not lose, the Dutch didn't have to outright defeat the Swedish fleet, they just had to batter it enough that the Swedish fleet couldn't suppress the Dutch fleet from passing through to Copenhagen and joining up with the Danish fleet. And at that point, well, having the weather gauge and shooting up your opponent's rigging and mast so they can't really maneuver or follow you is a relatively easy path to victory for the Dutch. In actual fact, there were more casualties in the Dutch fleet, but they achieved their objectives, whereas the Swedish forces, although yes, they did lose a few more ships, they actually suffered fewer men killed, wounded and captured, but they failed in their objective of keeping the Dutch away from the Danes. With Ebeltoft, it's a little bit easier. The Swedes have 8 frigates to the Dutch and Danes having a total of 5, so that's, an automatic advantage already. And if the Lanchester equations suggest that 8 versus 5 already is pushing for not quite a certain, but near certain victory for the side that has the 8, i.e. the Swedes. And combine that with the fact that the smaller force is also escorting a troop transport convoy, that pretty much spells disaster for the smaller fleet, almost regardless of anything else anyone tries. A master tactician might have been able to pull something off, but the problem is if you're escorting a troop convoy, you are tied to a certain speed and location. Now, once the battle starts, of course, you can increase speed and start to maneuver, but you are also going to almost certainly be a little bit spread out, unless you're sailing in a little squadron adjacent to the convoy. But whatever happens, you're going to be, to a certain extent, tied to that convoy. You can't maneuver for ideal tactical advantage because, again, if, let's say, the Swedish frigates are gunning for the troop transports, you have to interpose yourself, even if that puts you at tactical disadvantage with regards to the weather gauge or with regards to position, relative formation and crossing the T and that kind of thing, because your mission is to secure the transport. If it might be more advantageous to be on the other side, well, if you maneuver to be on the other side, the Swedes will just go, okay, fine, you're over there, the troop transports are over there, we're going to the troop transports, have fun with being over there and watching us take out the precious transports. So at that point, you have essentially a hobbled 5-ship escort formation against an 8-ship formation of roughly equal per ship strength, which is free to maneuver. It's not exactly surprising that that battle went the Swedes' way. SDF7 asks, whilst listening to you talking about the likelihood of upgrading armour, the thought occurred to me of a refit that changed out armour, guns, machinery, etc., which would likely be close to building a whole new ship, which of course evoked the Enterprise refit, quote-unquote, from Star Trek The Motion Picture, where perhaps a couple of structural frames were kept, but realistically very little else could have been from the original ship. So that raised the question in my mind, has there ever been such an uneconomical refit, be it for prestige or sheer stubbornness, in real life to a warship? The closest I can think of is I know some Age of Sail ships of the line would be broken up and the timbers reused into a new ship, possibly of the same name, but I can't think of one in the Age of Steam and Steel. Well, in the Age of Steam and Steel, you do have a few cases where a few minor elements of an old ship are incorporated into a new ship and it's technically called a refit. The US Navy pretty much takes the prize for that with the refits of a bunch of Civil War era monitors that have been left on the stocks that were then turned essentially into brand new ships. The old hulls pretty much being sold off, a few little scraps here and there maybe and being incorporated into the new hulls for the sake of propriety. But the thing is that, as ridiculous as it sounds, those quote-unquote refits, they produced vessels that at least had a degree of use at the time. If you want an example of a quote-unquote refit that essentially had 0 point to it despite costing a fair bit of money, look on screen. This is HMS Hercules. She's a mid to late 1860s era ironclad, and on the left you can see her in the form in which she was launched. Central battery ironclad, 10-inch guns on the broadside, reasonably typical, a little bit ahead of her time at the time that she is conceived. On the right is the refit HMS Hercules in the 1890s. Yes, in the era of pre-dreadnoughts. And yes, she kind of looks a little bit like a pre-dreadnought in silhouette, except for very quickly you'll begin to ask, where are the main gun turrets? Well, the answer is she doesn't have them. What she has is still her old muzzle-loading 10-inch central battery main battery and her iron armour. Now, yes, they've replaced the bow and stern chasers and they've added some lightweight quick-firing guns, and they've taken off the masts, and they've replaced the machinery, and they've replaced the superstructure, and they've replaced the funnels. But because they're using smaller propellers, she's not got really that much faster. In fact, in terms of reliable speed, she hasn't gotten any faster. And yeah, an 1860s era muzzle-loading short-barrel 10-inch gun, that's not really got the armour penetration capability to do any real damage to a modern combatant, considering we're, as I said, in the era of the pre-dreadnought by the time she comes out of refit. And she has 8-9 inches of iron armour. That's great in the 1860s. There is nothing in the primary battle lines of anybody that's not going to punch straight through that in the 1890s. The theory behind this, and a bunch of other modernizations that were done at the time, was to create what were called third-class battleships on the questionable premise that if you went to war and everybody had a grand battle of annihilation, and then you sent in the reserves and they had a great grand battle of annihilation, then in theory whoever was left who could bring anything to bear would be the winner. I mean, which presupposed, one, that the Royal Navy, the largest fleet in the world by a very, very large margin, was going to end up fighting a war so cataclysmic that it would essentially engage in mutually assured destruction with its first line and second line primary reserve vessels, with presumably whichever coalition they were fighting, on such a grand scale that neither side would be left with either pre-dreadnoughts or late-era turreted ironclads at all, to the point that poor old Hercules here showing up would somehow rule the roost by dint of being the only armoured warship, along with its friends, left afloat, because everything more advanced than it was dead. And this clearly presumed that literally no one on either side would survive that was much later, and that no one on either side would actually build any new ships with considerably better guns, armour, speed, etc., etc. So whereas as a refit, the building of something like, say, USS Puritan was hilariously uneconomical from a refit perspective, it still resulted in something that at least had some coastal defence properties, whereas the refit of HMS Hercules, which involved replacing almost everything except for those guns in the central battery and the basic frame of the hull and armour, resulted in something that at best might, if it was incredibly lucky, trouble a torpedo boat. Because even a protected or armoured cruiser wouldn't really be troubled by this thing, because it could just leave, followed presumably by a bombardment from beyond the range of these hopelessly obsolete guns, to which the old ironclad couldn't reply. John Plate asks, when it comes to the age of sail, the British had their sources of timber in the 13 colonies, but then once they got independence, they got them from the Baltic. Why wasn't Canada a prime source of timber for age of sail vessels? Were Canadian trees the wrong type, or was there a lack of industry in Canada? So the main sourcing of timber from the States and then later from the Baltic was for mast timber. Now, a lot of the pine that grew in eastern Canada was the same stuff that grew slightly further south in the US and was eminently suitable for use in masts for the Royal Navy. The major problem, though, was the development of industry, pretty much what you mentioned. The Canadian population around the time that the US gained independence barely amounted to a couple of 100,000, and even by the mid-part of the Napoleonic Wars, it was only approaching or around 300,000. Now compare that to just over 10 million people in the UK, as it was at the time, about 5 million or so in the US. Even Sweden had a population in the millions. And then look at where the majority of those 200,000 to 300,000 Canadians were concentrated. Spoiler alert, not mostly on and around the East Coast. And then given how many ships the Royal Navy had, how many masts each of those ships had, how many masts had to be kept in reserve for replacements, repairs, new ships, etc., the Canadian population could not sustain a forestry and wood preparation industry that would supply the Royal Navy with anything close to sufficient mast timber without a proportionally massive relocation of people and almost a retooling of the national economy. And that just wasn't viable. So whilst Canadian timber did feature in the Royal Navy, other elements, other of the world's trade infrastructure, like the Baltic, featured a lot more heavily. Plus, there were other ship supplies that you could get from the Baltic for things like tar for sealing up, tar and pitch for sealing up ships, caulking them, and various other types of supplies as well that a much more maritime developed country like Sweden, with a larger population, was able to support and supply. And you can see that even in the War of 1812, when the Royal Navy is having to build ships on the Great Lakes, building smaller ships, perfectly fine, everything can be sourced. But when it comes to building big frigates and ships of the line like HMS St. Lawrence, the local Canadian forestry is able to supply all the bulk timber you need to build a ship of the line, but the more complicated elements of the ship's rigging, the block and tackle, etc., it's just beyond the capabilities of local Canadian industry to supply that amount of equipment in time. And so HMS St. Lawrence actually goes to war with a lot of its rigging and other upper works seconded from a bunch of Royal Navy warships they didn't particularly need, which were over further out on the Canadian East Coast and had basically been dismasted, for lack of a better term, to donate their equipment to the St. Lawrence. Which also gives you an idea of the proportional resources available to both sides in the naval elements of the War of 1812, because the US Navy would have killed quite a lot of people to get their hands on a ship of the line of any description. Meanwhile, over a few miles to the north, the British were laying up 2 or 3 74-gunner third rates just so they could put their rigging on something else. Randwick78 asks, assuming that you had the needed funding, would it be possible to raise a ship that had no or relatively little structural damage, like HMAS Australia, and restore it to the point where it could be turned into a museum ship? If so, would a ship of Theseus refit of fittings and upper works that people could actually physically stand on be conducted, or would it be more of a Mary Rose situation where you could view the ship and artifacts from it but not actually board it? In theory it would be possible, but your choice of ship would have to be a very, very careful one. And that's because whilst a ship may have sunk substantially structurally intact, there are a few things that will, further complicate it. Firstly is how fast did the ship hit the bottom, and newer ships, i.e. ships made of iron and steel, generally speaking, if they've gone any particular depth, will tend to hit the bottom a lot harder than the older wooden ships, for the simple fact that a wooden ship that sinks has the majority of its hull, i.e. all the wooden parts, resisting the sinking, and the sinking itself is more governed by the heavier stuff on board, a combination of ballast, guns, other stuff that's denser than water, plus, of course, the water coming on board. And so, generally speaking, a wooden ship that goes over and sinks will impact with slightly less force at slightly less speed, and also generally the wooden ships will also just mass less, so they will have less inertia when they hit the seabed, and therefore are more likely to be substantially structurally intact, assuming that they're still there. But, of course, the flip side is that they're down there for a lot longer on average, which means that they might have rotted away, been worn away, etc. Whereas with a steel or iron vessel, whilst they will have been down there slightly shorter period of time on average, not only will they have hit the seabed probably harder and with more inertia, therefore more likely to have suffered structural damage upon landing, but of course iron and steel in most cases rust. So even if the ship settled fairly gently and appears to be substantially structurally intact, how much of the ship is now rust and what key members of the ship structurally have rusted away, yeah, that's a big question. Plus, of course, in the era of iron and steel, ship sizes ballooned, which means that any recovery effort is going to be exponentially more complicated by the fact that, if you're raising a Tudor period galleon, you're raising a ship that probably masses a few hundred tons. If you're raising a ship of the line, even a large one from the Napoleonic War period, you're raising a ship that's maybe the low thousands of tons displacement, assuming you found it substantially intact. If you're raising an ironclad from the early part of the ironclad era, the 1860s, 1870s, you're now looking at pushing 5 digits. I mean, yes, there are smaller ironclads, but if it's a big one, like, say, HMS Captain, you're going to be over the 5-digit limit, so 10,000 plus tons. And then once you get to something like Australia, you're talking about over 20,000 tons and so on and so forth, which is going to require massively more complicated lifting equipment. Because, yes, you can do things like they did when they were salvaging the wrecks of Scapa Flow after a few years, but one, those wrecks were going to the breakers, no one particularly cared if you dinged them up a little bit, and two, they hadn't been down there all that long, and they didn't have any major holes in them, they'd just been scuttled. So your big problem would be that even if a ship settled fairly gently without any major structural damage from landing, the simple act of hoisting a steel ship that's been underwater for a century or more, or an iron ship that's been down there for a century or more, that might well cause the ship to break apart. And then you've got to find somewhere to put it. And that's another factor. With something like Victory or Mary Rose or Vasa, compared to modern ships, they are relatively small, which means that not only is it easier to find space generally, but if you're looking for dockyard style space, there will be dry docks and dockyards and so forth, which fit them because, dry docks and so forth have been around as long as they have, but are no longer really substantially useful to the military. That's why Victory occupies the place that it does. It's in a dry dock that's in the middle of the HMS Nelson Portsmouth Naval Base, but the Royal Navy doesn't possess much outside of mine hunters that could actually physically use that dry dock anymore. But in theory, given the decline of shipbuilding, certainly in the Western world, in theory, you could maybe find an appropriate dry dock, whether you filled it with unique material, or just had it as a literal dry dock. You probably want to fill it, given the structural weaknesses of such an old wreck that you'd be hoisting up. You could, in theory, do it with enough money and refit and preserve the ship. Now, whether you ship of Theseus it into an accessible vessel or you turn it into an enclosed museum a la the Mary Rose or Vasa, that would really be down to the exact condition the ship actually, comes up in. Because if you have to essentially rip most of the ship apart to refit major structural members, then as a piece of archaeology, as a piece of history, it's probably not worth doing. Whereas if some point repairs or reinforcement of existing structure would allow at least a limited tour route to some of the more interesting places, then you might be onto something. But considering that, none of the ventilation and lighting systems, etc., are going to work, you'd be talking about, somebody like, well, Bill Gates is kind of out of the question. Steve Jobs is dead. But someone along those lines, someone with double-digit billions of dollars to their name, or possibly even triple-digit, who would just be like, yeah, whatever, have $1 billion, $2 billion to do this. I don't particularly care. I'm not going to miss it. That's the kind of funding levels that you would need, I think. You would actually be much better off, weirdly, going to somewhere like the Black Sea or the Baltic once everything calms down and finding one of those ancient hyper-preserved wrecks. There's some Phoenician ancient Greek era ships down there. Hoist one of those up. It's much smaller. It's probably actually significantly more intact. And we know how to preserve those things thanks to ships like Vasa, Mary Rose, and more recently the Newport ship. And there's probably going to be a lot more artifacts aboard that you can play around with to display. Which would actually be also quite fun because, who wouldn't? Well, okay, there are probably a bunch of boring people who wouldn't, but certainly amongst this audience here, who wouldn't want to go and see a 3,500-year-old Phoenician merchant vessel with its cargo? With all that being said, there are a few iron and steel era wrecks which probably could be salvaged because they are indicating by their continued existence they probably are strong enough to survive a lifting and restoration process fairly easily. Top of my list would be HMS Victoria because it's, well, one, a late period Victorian ironclad. We don't really have any late period Victorian era ironclad battleships left lying around that are original, at least. Secondly, it's a really fun, relatively unique design. And thirdly, the thing's still sitting vertically upright in the seabed. It's sustaining a structural load in a direction it was never meant to withstand, freestanding on its nose. If it's able to do that, I'm going to hazard that the majority of its structure is more than capable of standing up under its own weight if it were salvaged. JT Daily Update asks, if you've seen it, what are your thoughts about the film Godzilla -1 on its depiction of several different Japanese Navy vessels? Depending on how my voice is coping during the rest of this week, we will either have done a live stream by the time this video comes out or are about to do one, in which I suspect we'll probably be discussing this film a bit more. But I have now seen Godzilla -1, and seriously, apart from the fact it's a pretty good film, I think one of my favourite films of this year, it's also exceptionally good when it comes to the naval element and the general historical element, at least as far as the military section is concerned. Now, yes, of course, the kind of hand-wavy bits of why those ships are there in the first place is fantasy, but it's a Godzilla movie. Of course it's going to be fantasy. On the other hand, the amount of research and the amount of dedication they put into ensuring that these vessels are pretty much accurate is amazing, especially given that this is a film that had a budget of, I believe, 15 million. This film had a total budget that's less than the paychecks that some Hollywood films have for single actors. And yet, not only have they got the on-screen depictions of the Shinden, the aircraft, the Takao, spoiler alert, and the 4 destroyers, very much spot on, but they've also spent time making sure that each vessel is actually different to the others and in a historically accurate manner. And they also haven't arbitrarily chosen vessels from a list of Japanese ships. They've actually chosen Japanese Navy vessels that were historically still around at the end of World War II. Takao, as they say in the movie, was in Singapore. They didn't go with, we're just going to randomly resurrect Megami. They actually went with a ship that, in an alternate timeline that, has its departure point in late World War II and just after, would actually still be around. And they even went so far as to get the exact method of labeling the ships correctly. So you can see here the Yukaze, and there's also the Yukikaze, which we'll come to in a minute. And they've got their names down the sides, Japanese style, yes, except during the war, except it's in English. And I've seen some people go, but isn't this some artifact of making a movie for a Western audience? Well, firstly, if you've seen the movie, the entire thing is subtitled, it's in Japanese. Doesn't in the slightest actually reduce the enjoyment of the movie, to be honest. If anything, given obviously it's set in Japan, it makes it more realistic. And secondly, if you look at a picture or an actual historical picture of Yukikaze in the post-war environment, you'll notice that is exactly how Japanese ships were painted up in the post-war environment. They had their names in big letters on the sides in English. So absolutely fantastic level of detail. Any naval historian with a familiarity with Japanese World War II warships can immediately recognize the 4 separate classes of destroyer represented here. So they've done a good job with that. And once again, I'll come back to the budget. This is a sci-fi movie. It's not in any way, shape or form supposed to be a historic or semi-historic retelling of events. And yet, on this tiny budget, they've done far more to depict naval vessels accurately and plausibly within the limits of the scope of the movie than an awful lot of films with a budget 10 times that, which are supposed to be depicting historical periods and historical actions. If this was done by the people who cooked up the CGI for the Midway movie, for example, these 4 ships would be identical cookie-cutter clones and for some inexplicable reason would have torpedo turrets on their bows. Lord Nelson asks, given the track record of SMS Emden, was Graf Spee wrong when he tried to get his squadron back to Germany instead of dispersing it and wreaking as much havoc as possible? No, I think he was probably substantially correct, because if you look at the way things worked out, Emden was a good choice for solo raiding because she was relatively fresh and quite quick. If von Spee takes his entire East Asia squadron, some of his ships are about as quick as Emden, but some of them have been out there a lot longer and therefore won't actually be as quick because their engines will be more worn, their hulls will be more fouled, etc., etc. Plus, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are not as fast in the first place and will become progressively slower as well, which is historically what actually happened even heading across the Pacific and around South America. And when you look at the amount of resources available to hunt them in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, bear in mind that part of the reason that Emden managed to do what it did was because people were looking for von Spee's squadron for quite a while, and that diverted a fair bit of attention of the big hitters. And there's a lot of big hitters, because you've got the Australia, so that's 1 battle cruiser. You've got Congo, another battle cruiser. You've got Hiei Just, commissioning in August 1914, but technically speaking, there are 3 full-scale battle cruisers in the area. Plus, there's another 4 sort of battle cruisers in the Ibukis and Tsukubas. Now, whilst they're not actually full-on battle cruisers, they're they're the semi-battle cruiser, contemporary with a semi-dreadnought, if you like. They've got 12-inch guns, but both classes are capable of more than 20 knots. Both classes have a decent amount of protection, and as I said, they have their 12-inch guns, and the Ibukis in particular also have a battery of 8-inch guns. The Tsukubas are slightly less well-armed with a 6-inch battery, but nonetheless, they are markedly superior to the Scharnhorsts. So you've got 4 semi-battle cruisers, 3 actual battle cruisers, plus essentially most of the active components of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the rest of the Australian Navy, bits and pieces of the Royal Navy, the Russians and the French all in the area. And if von Spee's squadron disperses, that's an invitation to be very rapidly picked off by various, 2 and 3 ship contingents of Allied vessels in relatively short order. because if they're all in the area, that means all Allied resources get concentrated in the area to hunt them down with extraordinary rapidity, because of course not only are they all in one area, but they also present quite a lot more of a threat than just poor old Emden does. Onboard G1 asks, why didn't more nations, particularly the US, adopt the all-forward gun arrangement used in the design of Richelieu and Nelson? Well, almost everybody did actually look at this kind of design, and an awful lot of nations came very close to adopting it. The US, for example, for a very long time during the progress of the North Carolina class, were looking at an all-forward quadruple 14-inch armed ship. This is one of the design concepts shown on screen. But within each nation, they eventually abandoned the idea for various reasons, a lot of which were not strictly to do with the cost savings and displacement savings possible. For example, in the US, for a very long period during the North Carolina's design, there was an obsession with having a fixed percentage of the waterline armoured, and that negated most of the weight savings of having a shorter citadel that you got from the all-forward arrangement, at which point having a more conventional arrangement, if you're going to have a fixed length of your waterline armoured, doesn't make too much odds one way or the other. In the end, they did actually end up not quite following that rule, but by that point they changed the design. It was too late. With the Japanese, the Yamatos, again, they spent an awful lot of their design process being an all-forward designed ship. And the reason you ended up with something that looks vaguely like Yamato as the final stages of design essentially come down to, at the last minute, an attempt to get more than 9 guns on the ship, which required fore and aft armament, and then that was cut down, so you ended up back with 9 guns, but in fact there were more efficient 9-gun designs on the board as all forward designs. It's just that last stage, which had started out, as I said, as a desperate attempt to get more guns in, eventually reverted back via a series of minor refinements to the layout that we see now. The British looked into it. There's a whole list of reasons why the King George V ended up the way they did, but covered that in part in the King George V design video, maybe come back to that in the future. But essentially, outside of those issues that we just mentioned, an all-forward design has its advantages when you are constrained in some way displacement-wise. So if you are constrained by, say, a treaty limitation, or at the upper end of things, you're constrained by something like, say, dock size, then the savings made possible by an all-forward layout are superb. However, if you are unconstrained by either treaty limitations or dock size for whatever reason, then there are more advantages, or at least on paper, on going, especially in the world of needing a lot of anti-aircraft armament, to going with a more conventional fore and aft armament. Albeit, I would still maintain that an all-forward design where you still build up to a certain displacement, even if it's unlimited, would actually still be better, because you'd still be more efficient, so you could have a better ship for an arbitrary displacement, but that's just me. October Nid asks, what nation in the period the channel covers would benefit the most from modern resource maps and extraction methods, and in which era? At least for the main time periods the channel covers, it's quite simple. It's going to be the British Empire, simply because they controlled so much of the world for such a time period during the period that the channel covers. Now, if you go back into ancient times, there's probably some different things to be had, but in the time period that the channel primarily covers, so Age of Sail and up to the 1950s, well, prior to the British Empire, you've got the Dutch and Spanish and Portuguese empires, but the Dutch Empire doesn't occupy a huge amount of territory. It has mostly very small, isolated posts, mostly for trade. The Spanish, well, they were already extracting enough resources in precious metals and so forth out of South America to essentially cause runaway hyperinflation, and so which could only be solved, at least temporarily, by stealing even more gold and silver. But they don't need to be told where to find even more of it, and that kind of leaves you with the British Empire. And of course, if you go to the time period of late 19th and then early 20th centuries, with modern resources and extraction methods, that means they get control of a good chunk of the Middle Eastern oil fields, North Sea oil fields, and various rare resource extraction areas for trace and elements and so on and so forth, huge amounts of which would fall within the scope of Britain's ability to extract and use those resources. Heck, even if you want to go for an early atomic bomb project, there's a bunch of uranium in various territories which historically flew the British flag at one point or another in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even into the 20th century. So, when you occupy a quarter of the planet, you're going to have the most advantage when someone comes up with a map that says, here's a bunch of resources you didn't know about. Michael Imbezi asks, it's well known that ships in the destroyers for bases deal were usually fairly old and rusty, but for the tasks of convoy escort, were they better or worse than armed merchant cruisers? While I'm sure the crews probably would have preferred being stationed on a relatively large converted liner or something like that, the ex-Wicks and Clemson class destroyers were far better convoy escorts than our merchant cruisers would ever be, for quite a few reasons. Firstly, as Admiral Cunningham noted when somebody sent him some armed merchant cruisers in the early days of the Mediterranean fleet in World War II, every single armed merchant cruiser that you've gunned up and stuck on escort duty is it's a hull that's not doing cargo transportation duties, which are quite important, especially given the rate at which U-boats were sinking vessels in the early part of World War II. Another aspect is that our merchant cruisers will not be able to run away from or stand up to any kind of heavy merchant raider, and then generally speaking not equipped with particularly modern weapons or modern fire control systems. Now granted, the Wicks and Clemsons, when they come out of mothballs, are not the world's most advanced vessels, but their armament and systems are generally speaking somewhat more modern and superior to what you'd find in your typical merchant cruiser. Additionally, as I said, you've got the speed, so worst comes to worst, a destroyer can run if it comes across a cruiser or a battleship, and likewise if you have multiple destroyers escorting a convoy compared to multiple armed merchant cruisers, if a heavy cruiser or a Scharnhorst or something shows up, those destroyers can converge into a flotilla attack in a reasonable amount of time, and they carry torpedoes, which means they're still a threat to those bigger ships, whereas even if you've got 4 or 5 armed merchant cruisers escorting a convoy, if Scharnhorst shows up, all they can do is die heroically. Plus, of course, again with the speed issue, if a Wicks or Clemson class, now the town class destroyers, if they come across a submarine contact, they can chase after it and attack it, whereas an armed merchant cruiser can't. It has to pretty much stay with the convoy, which is a problem that the Flower class corvettes also had. So for those and quite a few other reasons, it's far better to have one of these old destroyers poking around as a convoy escort compared to an armed merchant cruiser. And finally, Lincoln Locker asks, was there much of a drawdown in the Allied forces in the Mediterranean after the Italian surrender? And if so, what units were redeployed and where to? Initially, no, because the Italian armistice arrived at the opening stages of the Salerno landings, which meant that the naval forces assembled for those landings were pretty much going to remain in place. And of course, you did have a rump fascist Italian state as well as the Germans still there, which meant that naval operations would still have to continue in the Mediterranean at a relatively high tempo. However, once it became relatively clear that the majority of the Italian fleet was either neutralised or part of the Italian co-belligerent navy, and the land campaign started to push further north, then towards the end of 1943, yes, elements of the forces in the Mediterranean could be withdrawn, because once the shore bombardment duties of the Salerno landings and associated operations had been conducted, with the Italian battle fleet out the way, there wasn't really much point in having a bunch of Allied battleships in the Mediterranean, because the Germans didn't have any surface major surface warships in there. You still had to have cruisers and destroyers because the Germans did have access to some smaller vessels they'd seized from the Italians, and there were U-boats still. But the big ships, like aircraft carriers and the battleships, could go. Some of the destroyers and cruisers could be drawn down. A bunch of the subs could be drawn down as well. Now, what happened to them is a mixture of things. Some were actually retained in the approximate vicinity for subsequent operations. A lot of them went back to their respective home nations for refits because they'd been in the Mediterranean for quite a while. And some of that was in preparation for D-Day. Some of that was in preparation for decoy operations for D-Day. Others, as I said, were either retained in the Med or would go back to the Med relatively soon thereafter for the invasion of southern France. And still others would be deployed to the Pacific-Indian Ocean theatre, and some of those that were refitted and either used in the D-Day or associated operations would then also go on to the Pacific theatre. So there was quite a distribution of forces, but it wasn't in, the Italians have signed an armistice, we're immediately decamping. There were several months of pretty much still at full strength operations by the Allies before you started to see at least the bigger ships start to trickle away. And that brings the final video of 2023 to an end, with just a couple of quick updates. For those of you wondering about the I Survived the Drydock Medal, I did actually get the master sent off to the manufacturer in time for when I said that was going to happen. However, I'd kind of forgot the whole Christmas thing, which apparently causes massive delays to production. And so, people ordering in mass for presumably selling in November and early December had ordered in August. So they are coming. I'm just sort of halfway through the queue at the moment. And for those of you who backed very kindly the Shipshape campaign back at the beginning of the year that managed to get us to Australia, since the first of the Australian videos is actually releasing at the time of this video's release in a few days on Wednesday, you probably deserve an update there. So for those rewards, there's obviously some digital rewards which are being sorted out separately, but for the physical rewards, people who are due books and things like that, what it comes down to is the manufacturer of the challenge coins that came with a lot of the reward levels, essentially not for the same reasons, but we have had manufacturing and supply issues with them as well. So we are hopefully getting on top of that, and I'm very, very sorry that some of you are going to have been waiting quite a few months to get elements of your backer rewards, but they will be coming as soon, literally within days of the coins arriving on my doorstep. It's just that since you are a wonderful international bunch of people, postage costs can be relatively high, and that's fine. But if we're going to be, spending international postage rates to send some of you guys a book or whatever, then, adding the weight of a challenge coin to that doesn't actually affect the cost of postage materially. But if we send out those rewards now, and then we had to send you your coin separately, even in a small, padded bag, that actually, one, we're having to ship things twice, and two, some of those international shipping rates start quite high and just go higher. So essentially what we want to do is send everything out all at once, and that is entirely dependent on when these coins arrive. But hopefully, fingers crossed, they will arrive in January, February next year, or probably, given when most of you will be listening to this stage of this part of the dry dock, this year. And yeah, with any luck, we'll get that sorted. If we still have problems and it's not looking like we're going to get a resolution by the end of January, i.e. if we don't have, your coins are in transit to me by the end of January, then I might just turn around and go, you know what, I'm going to start from scratch with a different manufacturer. Historically, this manufacturer has been pretty good. I don't know exactly what issues they have had, but they have had some issues this time round. Who knows? Anyway, apologies for that, and thanks for listening, everyone. See you in 2024.